Settle in, get comfortable, let your shoulders drop, and let the day you just had start to loosen its grip, because for the next couple of hours, you and I are going to take a slow, quiet walk through the shadows behind one of the most famous cartoons ever made. You already know the yellow shirt and the green pants. You already know the laugh, the talking dog, the baby with the strange little voice. What you might not know is everything that happened around the show. The near death that came before the first episode ever aired. The band stories locked away where almost nobody could see them. The real people who were hurt, who fought back, who sometimes even won. The strange nights when a silly, animated comedy seemed to reach into the future and pull out things it should never have been able to know. None of what I'm about to tell you is invented. Every piece of it is real, and taken together, it's stranger and darker than most of the jokes the show ever wrote. So close your eyes if you'd like, and let me tell you the true stories. The luckiest hangover in television history. Before there was ever a Griffin family, before there was a talking dog sipping a martini, before any of it, there was a young man in Boston who nearly did not live long enough to become famous. His name was Seth MacFarlane, and the reason you have ever heard that name at all comes down to a hangover and a travel agent who got a departure time wrong by half an hour. Let me take you back to the early autumn of 2001. MacFarlane was still a fairly new figure in television. His cartoon had premiered a couple of years earlier, had struggled in the ratings, had been shuffled around the schedule, and its future was anything but certain. He had been in the Northeast doing a speaking engagement, a talk at his old art school, the Rhode Island School of Design, where he had studied animation years before. When the engagement was over, he needed to fly back to Los Angeles, and he was booked on a morning flight out of Boston's Logan Airport. The flight was American Airlines Flight 11, scheduled to leave at 7:45 in the morning and carry its passengers across the country to California. The night before, MacFarlane did what a lot of young men in their 20s do when they finish a job and feel like celebrating. He stayed out. He drank more than he probably should have. He went to bed late and woke up feeling the full weight of it. On any ordinary morning, that would have been a small private misery, the kind you nurse quietly with coffee and regret. On this particular morning, it saved his life. There was a second piece of luck tangled up with the first. His travel agent had given him the wrong departure time. He had it in his head that the plane was leaving at 8:15, when in fact it was scheduled for 7:45, a full 30 minutes earlier. So between the slow, thick-headed start caused by the drinking and the mistaken time in his notes, MacFarlane arrived at the gate late. By his own account, he got there roughly 10 minutes after the doors had closed. The plane had already pushed back. He watched it go, feeling nothing more than the ordinary frustration of a traveler who has missed a flight and now has to rebook and wait around. He rebooked onto a later flight. He called his assistant to mention he would be arriving on a different plane than planned. And then, with time to kill and a head that still ached, he wandered into the airport lounge, found a quiet spot, and did the most human thing imaginable. He closed his eyes and took a nap. He slept for about 45 minutes, and when he woke up, the world had changed while he was unconscious. There was a commotion around him. People gathered, faces turned toward screens, a strange, charged silence in the air that anyone who lived through that day will remember for the rest of their life. He learned, slowly, in pieces, what had happened. The flight he had missed by 10 minutes, American Airlines Flight 11, had been hijacked shortly after takeoff and flown directly into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. Everyone aboard was killed. There were no survivors. The plane he had watched leave without him had become the very first weapon in the deadliest terrorist attack in American history. MacFarlane has described the moment of realization in interviews over the years, and there is a quiet, almost dazed quality to how he tells it. He turned to a man near him and said something to the effect of, "That was my flight, I was supposed to be on that." When he told the bartender in the lounge that he had been booked on the plane that had just crashed, the man, not knowing what else to do in the face of something so enormous, poured him a drink on the house. There is a smaller, human detail in this story that has always stayed with me, because MacFarlane had called ahead to say he was switching to a later flight, but the message did not reach the people who needed it in time. For roughly 20 minutes, some of the people who knew him believed he had died. They had heard which flight he was scheduled to take. They had seen the news. And in that gap between the crash and the moment his message finally landed, there were people grieving a man who was, at that very moment, sitting safely in an airport lounge with a free drink he did not want. When the truth caught up, the grief turned to relief. But those 20 minutes existed, and it is a strange thing to think that somewhere out there are people who spent part of that terrible morning mourning a man who would go on to live a long and enormously successful life. McFarlane never forgot who had, in a roundabout way, handed him those extra minutes. He later sent his travel agent a basket as a thank you gift, a small gesture toward the person whose scheduling mistake had accidentally kept him off the plane. It's a darkly funny footnote, the idea that a clerical error, the sort of thing that would normally earn a complaint, became the reason a person survived. Now, here is where the story deepens, and where it connects back to the world of the cartoon in a way that most people never realize. McFarlane was not the only figure from entertainment tied to that flight. The actor Mark Wahlberg had also been booked on Flight 11, and had changed his plans at the last moment, chartering a different way to travel. But there is one name aboard that plane that lands with a particular weight when you understand the history of McFarlane's show. One of the passengers who died on Flight 11 was a man named David Angel. He was a television writer and producer, and he was one of the creators of a hugely successful sitcom that ran for years on a rival network. That sitcom was Frasier. Sit with that for a moment, because the coincidence is almost too much to believe. When McFarlane's cartoon was in its early, fragile years, the network kept moving it around the schedule, and at one point they placed it in a time slot where it went head-to-head against Frasier. The competition was brutal, and the ratings suffered, and it was one of the factors that pushed the show toward cancellation. So the young creator whose cartoon had been beaten in the ratings by Frasier ended up on the same doomed flight as one of the men who made Frasier. One of them walked away because he was hungover and 10 minutes late. The other did not walk away at all. There is no lesson in that. No tidy meaning. It's just one of those cold, enormous coincidences that the real world produces without any regard for how a story is supposed to feel. For his part, McFarlane has been remarkably level-headed about his brush with death, almost stubbornly so. He has said more than once that he is not a fatalist, that the experience did not transform his entire outlook or fill him with a sense of cosmic destiny. In an interview a few years afterward, he made the point that all of us have close calls constantly, dozens or even 100 a year, moments where we crossed a street a little too early or a little too late, where some invisible thread of timing kept us safe without our ever knowing it. He said that maybe one day the full weight of it would really land on him. But he refused to treat his survival as proof that he was chosen for something. He had simply missed a plane before, the way everyone does, and this time missing the plane happened to mean everything. And yet, for all his insistence that it was pure chance, the shadow of that morning found its way into his work. The cartoon he created would go on, over the years, to reference the events of that day and the man behind them more than once, sometimes in ways that made audiences deeply uncomfortable. There is a famous later episode in which two of the characters travel back in time and end up in New York on that exact morning, and the show plays with the tension of characters who know what is about to happen standing in a place where they cannot stop it. Critics argued about whether it was brave or tasteless. What almost none of the viewers knew, as they watched, was that the man who had built the entire show had come within 10 minutes of being one of the names read aloud in the memorials. The person making jokes about that morning was a person who had been scheduled to die that morning. That is the first dark truth, and in a way it is the root of all the others, because everything that follows, every banned episode, every furious family, every lawsuit, every strange collision with the real world, only exists because a young man drank too much the night before a flight, and a travel agent wrote down the wrong time. Pull that single thread out of the past, change that one small morning, and none of the rest of this exists. The talking dog, the yellow shirt, the empire, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, all of it hangs on a hangover. When people say that history turns on tiny hinges, this is the kind of thing they mean. A splitting headache in a Boston hotel room became one of the quiet, load-bearing walls of American pop culture. Before I take you any deeper into the shadows, I want to ask you something, and it's a small thing that genuinely helps. Wherever you are right now, whatever corner of the world you've carried this voice into, whatever hour it is where you're lying there listening, let me know down in the comments. Tell me the place you're listening from and the time on your clock right now. I love reading them, quietly imagining all the different rooms and cities and hours where these stories are being heard at the same time. And if you're enjoying this, if you'd like more long, calm journeys like this one to drift off to, take a second to subscribe. It costs you nothing. And it means the quiet corner where these stories live gets to keep growing. Now let your breathing slow back down, and let's keep going, because the show that this lucky man built was about to die. Not once, but twice. The show that died twice. Most television shows die once, quietly, and stay dead. A network cancels them. The sets come down, the writers scatter to other jobs, and within a year or two, the whole thing is a memory that only the most loyal fans still bring up. What happened to McFarlane's cartoon was different, and when you look at it closely, a little unsettling, because the story of how it survived is really a story about how something can be killed for being unloved and then resurrected for being profitable, with almost no one asking whether those are the same thing. Let me walk you back through it slowly, because the timeline itself tells you something dark about how the machinery of entertainment actually works. The show premiered at the very end of January in 1999, and it premiered in one of the most valuable slots television has to offer, immediately after the Super Bowl. That is the golden ticket of scheduling. Tens of millions of people are already sitting in front of their screens, warm and fed and unwilling to move, and whatever comes on next inherits that enormous captive crowd. The first episode pulled in a staggering audience, somewhere in the neighborhood of 22 million viewers. For a brand new animated comedy from an unknown creator, that was a dream launch, the kind of number that should have guaranteed a long and comfortable life. But a Super Bowl audience is a loan, not a gift. Those millions were there for the football, and the show had to prove it could hold a real crowd on an ordinary night. And here is where the trouble began, and the trouble had almost nothing to do with the quality of the writing. The network could not decide where to put the show. During its second year, they moved it to Thursday nights, and in doing so, they dropped it directly into the path of Frasier, which was at that time one of the most beloved and heavily watched comedies in the country. Being scheduled opposite Frasier was close to a death sentence for a young, unproven cartoon. The audience that might have found McFarlane's show was already spoken for. The ratings sank. Rather than protect the show, the network kept shuffling it. They moved it to Tuesday nights, where it ran into another wall in the form of a wildly popular game show. The pattern repeated. The show would be placed somewhere, would get beaten by whatever juggernaut was sitting in that slot, and would then be moved again, often with very little warning. Imagine trying to build a loyal audience when your viewers can never be sure what night or even what hour your program will air. People would tune in and find something else, or miss it entirely. And slowly the network came to the conclusion that the low numbers proved the show was a failure, when in truth the numbers were partly the network's own doing. By the end of the third season in 2002, they made it official. The show was canceled. As far as anyone at the network was concerned, that was the end. The characters were finished. The story was over. Now, in almost any other case, that would genuinely have been the end. And you and I would never be having this conversation. Canceled cartoons do not come back. There is no mechanism, no tradition, no expectation of resurrection. Once a network has decided you are not worth the airtime, you are gone. But something happened in the quiet after the cancellation that nobody had planned and nobody had predicted, and it happened because of two forces that were reshaping how people watched television at the exact right moment. The first force was a late-night programming block on a cable channel devoted to adult-oriented animation. They acquired the rights to air reruns of the canceled show, and here is the detail that tells you how little anyone thought it was worth. They got those rights cheaply, because in the eyes of the industry the show was a corpse, and you do not pay a premium for a corpse. The reruns began airing in the spring of 2003, and what happened next was not gradual. Almost immediately, the show became the highest-rated program on the entire block. It dominated its time period against both cable and broadcast competition. By some measures, it lifted the viewership of the whole late-night block by well over 200%. The audience that the broadcast network had been unable to find, because it kept hiding the show, turned out to exist in enormous numbers. They had simply needed a stable place to find it, and a channel that treated the show as valuable rather than disposable. The second force was a shiny plastic disc. This was the era when people bought television shows on DVD, taking home entire seasons in glossy boxes to watch on their own schedule. The first collections of the canceled cartoon went on sale, and they sold in numbers that stunned everyone. Hundreds of thousands of copies moved off the shelves. For a show that had been declared dead, that was an extraordinary, almost impossible figure. And crucially, DVD sales are a different kind of signal than television ratings. A person watching a rerun costs the viewer nothing and commits them to nothing. A person buying a box set is reaching into their own pocket and handing over real money to own something they love. That is devotion you can measure in dollars, and dollars are the only language the industry truly speaks. So now put yourself in the position of the executives at the broadcast network that had canceled the show. You killed this thing because you were convinced nobody wanted it. And now you are watching it become the crown jewel of a rival channel's late-night lineup, while its DVDs fly off store shelves and a passionate audience grows louder by the month. What you are looking at is proof that you made a mistake, and more importantly, proof that there is money sitting on the table that you left behind. And so, by 2004, the same network that had canceled the show twice reversed course and ordered new episodes. A fourth season was set to arrive. The dead had been raised. Fans understandably treated this as a triumph. A beautiful story of a beloved show clawing its way back from the grave on the strength of pure audience love. And that reading is not wrong, exactly. The love was real. The devotion of those early fans genuinely did bring the show back. But there is a colder truth underneath the warm one, and it's worth naming as we lie here in the quiet. The show did not return because the network suddenly recognized its artistry, or felt guilty about how it had been treated, or came to believe in the vision of its creator. The show returned because the numbers now proved it was profitable, and profit is a force that moves through the entertainment industry the way gravity moves through the sky. The moment the ledgers showed that this canceled cartoon could make money, its cancellation was reversed. Had the reruns flopped, had the DVDs gathered dust, the show would have stayed exactly as dead as the network had left it, and all its quality and all its cleverness would have meant nothing. This is the first appearance of a theme that will follow us through the rest of these stories like a low, steady drumbeat, so let me plant it here. From this point forward, the survival of the show would be tied, again and again, to the question of whether it made money, and that question would gradually crowd out almost every other consideration. In its earliest years, before the cancellation, the show had been a fragile personal thing, closely guided by the young man who had nearly died to make it. After the resurrection, it became something else. It became an asset, a valuable property. A machine that generated revenue, and machines that generate revenue are protected not because they are loved, but because they are useful. There is one more layer of darkness folded into the resurrection, and it has to do with what those 3 lost years did to the show itself. When a program is canceled, its writers cannot simply sit in a dark room and wait, hoping against reason for a call that will probably never come. They have careers, rent, families. They move on to other shows, other projects, other lives. So when the network finally ordered new episodes, the room that had crafted the beloved early seasons was no longer fully intact. Some of the original voices were gone. New writers came in, bringing new sensibilities. MacFarlane himself later pointed out that one of the lasting effects of the show being yanked off the air over and over was that they were constantly having to bring in fresh writers to replace the ones who had drifted away. So the show that returned in 2005 was, in a subtle but real sense, a different creature wearing the same skin. It looked like the show that had died. It sounded like it. But some of the people who had given it its original soul were no longer in the room, and the version that came back would slowly, over the years that followed, drift away from what it had been. So the resurrection, celebrated as a miracle, carried its own quiet losses. The show came back, but it came back changed, staffed differently, reborn as a business proposition, and set on a path where the central question was no longer only whether it was good, but whether it was profitable enough to keep alive. And it was. It was profitable enough to survive not just for a few more years, but for decades, long past the point where many of its own fans would argue it should have been allowed to rest. The dead thing that came back would prove almost impossible to kill again, and that too is a kind of darkness. The darkness of something that keeps going long after the reasons for it have quietly changed. Let that settle for a moment. Breathe slow. The show has been reborn now, bigger and more valuable than ever, and it is about to enter the strangest chapter of its whole existence, the years when it seemed, over and over, to somehow know things about the world before the world knew them itself. The cartoon that seemed to see the future. There is a particular kind of unease that comes from watching an old cartoon and realizing it seemed to know something it should not have been able to know. Not a vague general prediction, the kind anyone could make, but a specific, pointed one, naming a specific person, describing a specific kind of wrongdoing, years before the rest of the world had any proof. Over the course of its long life, MacFarlane's show developed a reputation for exactly this, and the pattern became so pronounced that the show's own studio eventually leaned into it, put it on marketing materials, and dared people to wonder how a comedy about a cartoon family kept describing real scandals before they broke. To understand why this is genuinely unsettling, and also why the truth behind it is darker and more human than any supernatural explanation, we have to walk through the specific cases, one at a time, in the quiet. Let's begin with the one that started the whole reputation. In 2005, in the 4th season, there was a brief throwaway gag. The baby character comes running through a crowded shopping mall, naked, in a panic, screaming for help and claiming he has just escaped from the basement of a specific, named, very famous actor. That actor was Kevin Spacey. In the moment, in 2005, most viewers simply laughed and moved on, if they registered it at all. It was a strange, edgy little joke about a celebrity, the sort the show tossed off by the dozen. No one thought much about it. Then, more than a decade later, in the autumn of 2017, the world changed. An actor came forward with an allegation that Kevin Spacey had made an unwanted sexual advance toward him when he was 14 years old. That allegation opened the floodgates, and many more accusations followed, and one of the most acclaimed actors of his generation saw his career collapse almost overnight. And as this was happening, someone remembered the cartoon. Someone dug up that old clip from 2005, the naked baby screaming about escaping from Kevin Spacey's basement, and it spread across the internet like fire. How? People asked. Could a cartoon have made that exact joke about that exact person 12 years before the truth came out? Did they know something? Did everyone know something? The show's creator was eventually asked about it directly at a press event, and his answer is one of the most important keys to this entire mystery, so listen closely. He said, more or less, that the myth of the show as some kind of psychic oracle was overblown, sensationalized. He compared the idea to the notion that the show was a kind of cartoon Ouija board, spelling out the future, and then he explained what had actually happened. He said that when the joke was pitched in the writer's room all those years ago, he himself had not even heard the rumor it was based on. It had to be explained to him by other writers in the room, who told him there was talk going around about Spacey. In other words, the joke was not a prediction at all. It was a rumor. It was a piece of industry gossip, an open secret that circulated among people who worked in that world, whispered at parties and in hallways, long before any victim was willing or able to come forward publicly. The writers heard the whisper, and they turned it into a joke, and then they moved on, and the whisper sat frozen in that cartoon for 12 years, until the day the world finally caught up to what those insiders had been murmuring all along. One of the show's other producers filled in a little more of the story. He recalled that the timing of the Spacey joke may have been connected to a strange real incident back in 2004, when Spacey had reported to police in London that he had been mugged, then later changed his account, saying instead that he had tripped over his dog. The shifting story raised eyebrows among people who were already inclined to gossip, and it may have been part of what put the rumor in the air that the writers then reached for. So the prediction was really the residue of a rumor that had a real traceable origin. It was not the show seeing the future. It was the show acting as a kind of tape recorder for the ugly things that powerful people in that industry had known and said quietly to one another for years. Once you understand that mechanism, the other so-called predictions all fall into place, and they become, if anything, sadder and more damning rather than more magical. Because the show did it again and again. There was a moment involving the director Bryan Singer, folded into an episode, at a time when he too was only the subject of industry rumor. There was a reference tied to the producer Brett Ratner, in an episode that aired years before the public accusations against him. The pattern was consistent. The show kept naming or gesturing toward powerful men in the entertainment industry at moments when their alleged behavior was, in the words of the show's own producers, only murmur, only rumor, only the kind of thing that everybody in a certain circle seemed to know and nobody outside it was allowed to hear. Then there is the case that is perhaps the most personal and the most revealing, and it did not happen inside the cartoon at all. In early 2013, McFarlane hosted a major awards ceremony, and during a broadcast announcing that year's nominations, standing beside the actress Emma Stone, he read out the list of nominees in a particular category and then made a sharp, pointed joke. He congratulated those women by saying they would no longer have to pretend to be attracted to the producer Harvey Weinstein. In the moment, in 2013, it landed as an edgy, slightly bewildering barb, and most of the audience laughed nervously and did not fully understand it. Years later, when Weinstein was exposed as one of the most prolific alleged sexual predators in the history of the industry, that old joke resurfaced and was replayed everywhere as evidence that McFarlane had known. And here the story turns genuinely dark, because the reason McFarlane made that joke was not comedy. He later explained, in an emotional public statement, that a close friend of his, an actress who had appeared in his films and had a recurring role on his cartoon, had confided in him about a frightening encounter she had experienced with Weinstein. He believed her. He was furious on her behalf. And so, when he had a microphone and a global audience, he used a joke as a weapon, a way of publicly needling a man he despised for a specific and real reason. What looked, in hindsight, like eerie foresight was actually something much more grounded and much more human. It was a man who knew a true thing about another man and who could not say it plainly, and so said it sideways, in the only form the moment allowed, as a joke that most people did not understand until years later. The show eventually gathered all of these strands together in the most audacious way. In an episode in the middle 2010s, they staged a scene depicting a whole gathering of alleged Hollywood abusers, a grim roll call of powerful names, sitting together in a room. And notably, they left one particular figure out of the room, using his absence as its own pointed comment. The studio then took the show's reputation for this sort of thing and put it directly onto official awards campaign materials, with the main character standing in front of the famous hills, over text bragging that the show had predicted these scandals, inviting the viewer to open the package and see who might be next. When they opened it, they found a mirror. It was a clever, self-aware gag, but sit with what it really means. The studio was marketing the show's uncanny ability to name predators before the public knew, treating an ugly, painful pattern of exposed abuse as a promotional bragging point. McFarlane and his producers have been fairly honest about the whole thing, and their honesty is the darkest part of all. One of the showrunners put it plainly. He acknowledged that it was a terrible thing to say, but that they had genuinely had a run of good luck predicting who the predators would turn out to be, and he explained the method with unsettling simplicity. There were always rumors out there, he said, about certain people, and the writers would simply put those things into the show. They would write down what they heard. And then, a year and a half later, it would be on television. And 10 years after that, it would happen for real, out in the open, in a courtroom or a headline. That is the whole trick. That is the entire supernatural mystery, deflated into something far more disturbing than magic. The show was not psychic. It was a mirror held up to an industry full of open secrets. And the reason it kept getting the future right is that the future was already fully known to the people at the top. They just weren't telling the rest of us. Think about what that actually implies as you lie there in the dark. Every time that cartoon seemed to see the future, what it was really doing was proving that a great many powerful people already knew the present. They knew, and they said nothing publicly, and they kept working with these men, and they let the whispers stay whispers, sometimes for decades, while victims suffered in silence with no proof and no voice. The joke in the cartoon was the only place the truth was allowed to surface, disguised as comedy so it could slip past the defenses that would have crushed a direct accusation. A serious allegation could be denied, buried, litigated into oblivion. A joke was just a joke. And so the truth hid inside the jokes, waiting. That is why the predictions are, in the end, one of the darkest truths about this show, far darker than any ghost story. They are not evidence of a cartoon that could see tomorrow. They are evidence of a world that already knew today and chose again and again to look away. The show simply refused to look away, or at least refused to stop making jokes, and by refusing, it accidentally became a record of everything the powerful preferred to keep quiet. When you laugh at those old clips now, there is something underneath the laugh. A cold little recognition that the joke was never really a prediction. It was a confession, made on behalf of people who would never have confessed on their own. Breathe. Let that one drift down slowly. Because the next story is about the one time this collision between the cartoon and the real world went horribly, painfully wrong, when a joke made long before a tragedy got tangled up in that tragedy in a way nobody involved could have wanted. The bombing that wasn't a prediction. The story I just told you was about a show that seemed to know the future because it was really repeating the present. This next story is about the terrible flip side of that reputation, the moment when the internet convinced millions of people that the show had predicted a real atrocity, and how a piece of digital dishonesty turned a cartoon into an accidental villain in one of the most painful weeks in recent American memory. It is a story about how easily a lie can travel, and how a joke, sitting harmlessly on a shelf, can be dragged into a nightmare it had nothing to do with. In the middle of March, in 2013, the show aired an episode. In it, one of the characters befriends a man who turns out to be involved with a terrorist plot, and the story wraps around themes of radicalization and bombs. Like almost every episode of this show, it was stuffed with unrelated little cutaway gags, those quick, disconnected jokes that jump away from the main story for a few seconds before snapping back. One of these throwaway gags, completely disconnected from the plot, showed the main character somehow winning the Boston Marathon, and the way he won it was by driving his car straight through the runners, mowing them down. It was crude, over-the-top, tasteless cartoon violence of exactly the kind the show trafficked in constantly. In the context of a normal week, it would have been forgotten within days. One more shock gag in a show built on shock gags. But the week that followed was not a normal week. About a month after that episode aired, in April of 2013, 2 bombs went off near the finish line of the actual Boston Marathon. People were killed. Many more were terribly wounded, some losing limbs. The city was plunged into terror, then into a massive manhunt that shut down entire neighborhoods. It was a genuine tragedy, a real attack on real people at a beloved public event, and the whole country watched it unfold with horror. And in the churning, frantic, grief-stricken days that followed, when everyone was desperate to understand and the internet was moving faster than the truth ever could, someone did something cruel and dishonest. An anonymous person took that recent episode and edited it. They found the cutaway gag of the character driving through the marathon runners, and they found a completely separate scene from later in the very same episode, a scene in which the character accidentally triggers explosions by dialing a cell phone. These 2 moments had nothing to do with each other in the actual episode. They were in different parts of the story, serving different jokes. But the editor spliced them together, cutting them so that it appeared the character mowed down marathon runners and then set off bombs, as if the cartoon had laid out a blueprint for the exact attack that had just happened in real life. That edited clip went viral almost instantly. And the reason it spread so fast is that it fed a hunger that always appears after a tragedy, the hunger for a hidden pattern, a secret hand, a sense that these things do not just happen randomly but are somehow foretold or even orchestrated. The doctored clip was seized upon and amplified by a well-known conspiracy broadcaster, pushed out to an audience already primed to believe that dark forces plant clues in plain sight. Suddenly, a huge number of people believed that the show had predicted the Boston Marathon bombing in precise, chilling detail. Some went further and suggested the cartoon had somehow inspired it. The show and its creator found themselves accused of foreknowledge of a real massacre, all on the strength of a video that had been deliberately manipulated to say something the original episode never said. Here is the truth, plainly, because it matters. The real episode contained no such prediction. In the actual footage, the marathon gag and the explosion scene were separate, and in the marathon gag itself, there were no bombs at all, just the crude, stupid joke of a character winning a race by driving through it. The connection that made it look prophetic was invented in an editing program by an anonymous person after the fact. It was, in the flattest possible terms, a hoax. Fact-checkers and journalists examined it carefully and concluded that the supposed parallels between the episode and the real bombing were thin at best and had been grossly exaggerated by unreliable sources, spreading the doctored version. The prediction was not real. It was manufactured out of grief and dishonesty in the days after an atrocity. MacFarlane, watching his show get dragged into the aftermath of a mass casualty event on the basis of a lie, responded publicly and quickly. He called the edited clip circulating online abhorrent. He said, simply and directly, that the event had been a crime and a tragedy, and that his thoughts were with the victims. There was no defensiveness in it, no attempt to salvage the joke, just a flat repudiation of the manipulated video and an acknowledgement of the real suffering it was exploiting. Other members of the show's team echoed him, sharing his statement, distancing the show from the thing that had been made to look like the show. The network, for its part, made a decision that speaks to how radioactive the whole situation had become. They pulled the episode, they removed it from their website, from the streaming service, from the platforms where people could buy it, and they stated that they had no immediate plans to broadcast it again. This is a common thing that networks do after tragedies, quietly pulling any material that might, even by accident, brush against fresh wounds. It was not an admission of guilt. It was an act of caution and, arguably, of basic decency, the recognition that even a wrongly accused episode had now become so entangled with real pain that airing it would only hurt people. That same week, a completely different, unrelated sitcom pulled one of its own episodes simply because it contained a passing mention of a suspicious bag. That is how careful everyone was being. The episode then entered a kind of exile. For years, it was one of the hardest episodes of the entire series to find through official channels, quietly withheld while the rest of the enormous library remained available. It was not until the autumn of 2022, nearly a full decade after the bombing, that the episode was quietly returned to the streaming service, allowed back into circulation now that the immediate rawness of the tragedy had faded into history. But for the better part of 10 years, that episode carried a stain it had never actually earned, banished not because of what it was, but because of what a stranger with editing software had made people believe it was. There is something worth pausing on here, a lesson folded inside the darkness. The so-called predictions we talked about earlier were, at their core, real, in the sense that the show genuinely did make those jokes about those real people before the public scandals broke. But this one, the most spectacular and viral prediction of all, the one that convinced the largest number of people, was completely false. It was a fabrication. And yet, in the frantic emotional weather after the bombing, the fabricated predictions spread faster and convinced more people than any of the real ones ever had. That should tell you something unsettling about how these stories work. The appetite for the pattern is so strong that the truth of the pattern almost does not matter. People wanted the cartoon to have known, because a world where the cartoon knew is somehow less frightening than a world where two young men simply built bombs and set them off among strangers for reasons that make no sense. A prophecy, even a sinister one, imposes order on chaos. The doctored clip offered that false order, and a grieving public grabbed for it. So, the darkest truth of this chapter is not really about the show at all. The show, in this one case, was innocent, wrongly accused, its crude joke twisted into a false confession by an anonymous hand. The darkness here belongs to us, to the audience, to the way a lie shaped to look like foresight can outrun the truth so completely that a network feels compelled to hide an episode for a decade to escape a crime it never committed. The show spent years absorbing the shadow of a tragedy it had nothing to do with, all because a stranger wanted the internet to believe in a monster that did not exist. And that is a strange and quiet kind of injustice, the sort that leaves no clear villain to blame and no clean resolution, just an episode locked away for years and a false memory lodged in millions of minds. Even now, if you mention this show and the Boston Marathon in the same breath, a great many people will nod knowingly and repeat the myth as fact. The correction never travels as far as the lie. It almost never does. Let your mind rest on that for a moment. The way a false story can bury a true one so completely that the burial itself becomes the thing people remember. And now let me take you toward the episodes that really were hidden, deliberately, by the people who made them and the people who paid for them. The stories that were considered so dangerous that they were locked away on purpose, some of them never shown on American television at all. The episodes you were never meant to see. Every long-running show has episodes that fans argue about, that split the audience, that some people love and others despise. But there is a rarer, stranger category, the episode that was made, finished, fully animated, scored and completed, and then locked in a vault by the very network that paid for it, deemed too dangerous to ever put on the air. MacFarlane's show has more than one of these hidden episodes, and the stories of how they came to be buried tell you a great deal about the fault lines running through American culture, and about how the people who control what you watch make their decisions, which is almost always about money in the end, no matter what reasons they give out loud. Let me tell you first about the earlier one, because it came in the show's fragile early years and it nearly became the show's original ending. This was an episode built entirely around a Jewish theme, in which the dim-witted father, after losing the family's money in a foolish scam, falls for an old and ugly stereotype, the belief that a Jewish person will be better with money and can rescue him from his troubles. He befriends a Jewish accountant, becomes fascinated with the man's religion, and gets it into his head that he can secure his own son's future by having the boy convert to Judaism. His wife tries to stop him, and the whole thing builds toward a chaotic climax at a synagogue. The intent, according to the people who made it, was satire. The joke was supposed to be on the father, on his ignorance, on the stupidity of the stereotype itself. He is not meant to be malicious. He is meant to be a fool who believes something absurd, and the episode was designed so that he learns, by the end, that success has nothing to do with religion. To reinforce that this was satire rather than genuine prejudice, MacFarlane later noted that he had shown the script to 2 rabbis before production, both of whom approved it because the father learns the right lesson in the end. He also pointed out that a large majority of the show's writing staff at the time was Jewish, including the writer who actually wrote the episode, and that the accountant was voiced by a well-known Jewish performer. None of that mattered to the executives at the broadcast network. When they looked at the finished episode, they saw not the intended satire, but the potential for disaster. They worried that a huge portion of the audience would miss the irony entirely, would not understand that the father was the butt of the joke, and would instead see a primetime cartoon trading in anti-Semitic imagery. They were afraid of the backlash, afraid of the headlines, afraid of the advertisers. And so, after the episode had been completely finished, they made the decision not to air it. They shelved it. For years, one of the finished episodes of the show simply did not exist as far as broadcast television was concerned, held back out of fear of how it might be received. It sat in that limbo for a remarkably long time. It was originally intended to air around the year 2000, but it did not reach the public until it surfaced on that late-night cable block in 2003, and it did not air on the original broadcast network until 2004, roughly 4 years after it was made. And when the network finally did air it, they made a small but telling change. There was a line in the father's musical number that referred, in a crude old religious slur, to Jews having killed Christ. For the broadcast version, MacFarlane recorded an alternate line that softened it, having the character express doubt about that old accusation rather than stating it. The joke was still there, but the sharpest edge had been sanded down to make it acceptable for a wider audience. Even that was not the end of the trouble for this episode, because it also became the target of a lawsuit, though not for the reasons you might expect. The father's musical number was a parody of a very famous song, one of the most beloved wishing songs in the history of American animation, associated with a certain wooden puppet who wanted to be a real boy. The company that owned that famous song sued, arguing that the crude parody harmed the reputation and value of their beautiful original by associating it with offensive lyrics. The case went to court, and the court ultimately sided with the show, ruling that the parody was protected, that it borrowed no more of the original than was necessary to make the target recognizable, and that it did not damage the market for the real song. So the show won, and the episode survived, and today it airs freely, and most people cannot even understand what all the fear was about. But for those 4 years, it was hidden, a completed piece of work that the network was too frightened to show. Now let me tell you about the other one, the truly buried episode, the one that to this day has never aired on American television at all, not on the original network, not on the late-night cable block that had rescued so much of the show's early material, not anywhere on American airwaves. This episode is about abortion, and the reason it remains hidden is a window into exactly how the machinery of decision-making really works behind the curtain. The story of the episode is, by the show's standards, unusually thoughtful. The mother of the family agrees to become a surrogate, to carry a baby for an old friend who cannot conceive. She goes through with the procedure, and then, in a cruel turn, the biological parents, the couple the baby was meant for, are killed in a car accident. This leaves the mother in an agonizing position, pregnant with a child that was never meant to be hers, facing an impossible decision about whether to carry the pregnancy to term or to end it. The father, in typical fashion, careens through several contradictory positions, at one point getting whipped into a frenzy by anti-abortion activists. But the striking thing about the episode, the thing critics who eventually saw it on DVD kept remarking on, is that it does not cop out, it does not dodge. After genuine struggle, the mother makes a definite choice. The episode commits to it, and it actually takes a position rather than hiding behind a joke. For a show so often accused of cowardice and randomness, it was a surprisingly brave piece of writing. MacFarlane reportedly asked one of his writers to read a famous essay on the ethics of abortion before writing the script, wanting the episode to have real weight underneath its jokes. That bravery is precisely what got it buried. The episode was approved for production. It was made. And then the broadcast network exercised its right not to air it, deciding the subject was simply too dangerous. And here's the part that pulls back the curtain on how these choices are truly made. The president of the network's entertainment division later explained the decision, and he was refreshingly, almost brutally honest about it. He did not claim the episode was badly made. In fact, he admitted it handled the subject fine. He did not frame it as a moral objection. He framed it as a business problem. He said that of all the hot-button issues, abortion was the most explosive, and that this particular moment happened to be a difficult economic time, with hard conversations already going on with the advertisers who paid the bills. The advertisers, he said, knew what they were getting with this show in general, but this episode felt like it could cause trouble, and it was, in his words, just not worth it. Let that sink in, because it is one of the clearest confessions of how this all really works that you will ever hear. The episode was not banned because it was bad. It was not banned because it was immoral. It was banned because, at a moment when money was tight and advertisers were nervous, the risk of controversy was judged to be worth more than the episode itself. The calculation was purely financial. A completed, thoughtful, well-crafted piece of television was locked away not for any high principle but because it might spook the companies whose commercials paid for the airtime. This is the machinery beneath everything you watch, the quiet weighing of controversy against revenue, and here it was, stated out loud, without apology. The late-night cable block that had aired the earlier buried episode declined to air this one too, so it had nowhere to go on American television. It was released instead straight to DVD tucked into a special package, available to anyone willing to seek it out and pay for it, but never broadcast. Curiously, it did air overseas. Audiences in the United Kingdom saw it on television as part of the normal run of the season, watched by close to 1 million homes. A completely ordinary broadcast in one country of an episode that was considered untouchable in another. The same finished piece of animation was either perfectly acceptable or absolutely forbidden, depending entirely on which nation's advertisers and executives were making the call. And the strangest twist of all is what happened as the years went by. Rather than becoming less hidden over time, this episode became more hidden. As the show moved on to newer streaming platforms owned by ever larger corporations, the buried episode did not come along for the ride. On the major service where nearly the entire massive library of the show lives, this one episode is simply absent, a gap in the collection, a missing tooth. Even as everything loosened around it, even as the culture shifted and the show aged into an institution, this one episode stayed locked away, and there has been no indication that the people who now own it have any intention of ever letting it out. It remains the great unseen episode, the story its own network paid for and then decided you were never meant to watch. There is a quiet, heavy irony in all of it. This show built its entire reputation on being fearless, on saying the unsayable, on offending everyone equally and never backing down. And yet its two most notorious episodes are the two it was too afraid to air, or rather the two the money was too afraid to air. The show could joke about almost anything, could wade into the most grotesque and taboo material week after week, and the machine that carried it would shrug and cash the checks. But touch the 2 or 3 subjects where the advertisers might actually flinch, and suddenly the fearless show discovered it had limits after all. Limits that had nothing to do with taste or decency and everything to do with what the sponsors would tolerate. The bravery was always real, right up until the moment it threatened the revenue, and then it quietly vanished and the episode went into the vault, and there it stayed. Let that settle. The picture is getting clearer now. This sense of a show that will go anywhere the money allows and nowhere the money forbids. And with that in mind, let me take you into the darkest of the real-world collisions. The times when the show reached out and mocked actual suffering, actual grief, and the people carrying that grief looked up and saw themselves turned into a punchline, mocking the dying. Some of the darkest truths about this show are not hidden at all. They aired in prime time, in front of millions of people, and the darkness is not in what was concealed but in what was shown openly and defended afterward. This next story is one of those, and it involves a real woman, a real death, and a real family's grief, turned into a song and dance number for laughs. It is one of the moments that even devoted fans of the show tend to fall silent about, because it is genuinely hard to find the joke in it once you know the full weight of what it touched. To understand it, you have to remember a story that gripped the entire United States in the middle of the 2000s. There was a woman named Terri Schiavo. Years earlier, still young, she had collapsed and suffered catastrophic brain damage, leaving her in what doctors described as a persistent vegetative state. She survived, but she could not communicate, could not respond, could not, according to the medical consensus, experience the world in any meaningful way. She required a feeding tube to stay alive, and around her body a devastating legal and moral war broke out that lasted for years. Her husband argued that she would not have wanted to be kept alive in that condition and sought to have the feeding tube removed. Her parents and siblings fought fiercely to keep her alive, believing she still had awareness, still had a chance, still deserved every effort. The case climbed through courts, drew in politicians at the highest levels, dominated the news, and split the country. It became one of the most emotionally charged public battles over life, death, and disability in a generation. In the spring of 2005, after the feeding tube was removed for the final time, Terri Schiavo died. Her family did not stop grieving when the cameras moved on. They founded a foundation in her memory. Her brother, in particular, became a full-time advocate, speaking about disability rights and about his sister. The wound of losing her, and of losing her in such a public and contested way, did not close. It could not. She had died at the center of a national storm, and her family had to carry that for the rest of their lives. Now come forward to 2010, roughly 5 years after her death. MacFarlane's show aired an episode that opened with a fake school play, a little musical number performed by the show's cartoon children. And the subject of that musical number was Terri Schiavo. The song made light of her condition directly, with lyrics that mocked her as being only barely alive, and that reduced her to something less than a person, comparing her to a houseplant, joking that she was the most expensive plant anyone would ever see, an object whose only notable quality was the cost of keeping it alive. At one point in the number, a character playing her husband declares that she is a vegetable, and the chorus responds with a cheerful line about hating vegetables, and the fictional audience in the sketch bursts into laughter. The timing was its own kind of cruelty, whether intended or not. The episode aired only about 10 days before the 5th anniversary of Terri Schiavo's death, and it aired just weeks before her family's foundation was set to host a memorial concert in her honor. So, into the run-up to the anniversary of a woman's death, into the season when her family would be mourning her most acutely and preparing to celebrate her memory, dropped a primetime cartoon musical number, reducing her to a punchline about houseplants and hospital bills. The family reacted exactly as you would expect any grieving family to react. Her brother spoke out publicly. He described his family's astonishment at the cruelty they saw in the show. Cruelty aimed not only at his beloved sister, but, as he saw it, at everyone living with serious cognitive impairment. He argued that the episode did more than tell a tasteless joke, that it seemed to promote the idea that some people are simply not worth the cost of caring for, that certain lives can be measured against a price tag and found too expensive to keep. For a family that had spent years insisting that their daughter and sister still mattered, still had worth, still deserved care, watching her turned into a cheerful song about an overpriced plant was a fresh and pointed wound. He called it, in his own words, a form of hate speech. And he pointed out that there are other ways to make people laugh, and that this was not one of them. The family called for a boycott. Their foundation urged people to pressure the show's sponsors and advertisers to hit the machine where it was vulnerable in its revenue. Disability rights advocates joined the outcry, arguing that the episode showed prejudice against people with brain injuries, that it mocked a whole category of vulnerable human beings by mocking the most famous one. This was not a niche complaint. It came from people with real standing to make it, people who lived with disability themselves, people who had watched the Schiavo case with a personal stake because the questions it raised were questions about their own lives and worth. And how did the show and its creator respond? Not with an apology. McFarlane's defense, when it came, leaned on the idea of a double standard. He noted that a rival animated show had also made jokes referencing the Schiavo case, and he expressed frustration that his show was catching so much heat for doing something similar. Why, he essentially asked, is it acceptable when they do it and a scandal when we do it? To him, it looked like unfair treatment, like his show being singled out for the same kind of dark humor that others got away with. But the people who studied both shows saw a difference that McFarlane seemed to miss, and it is worth understanding because it goes to the heart of what separates real satire from simple cruelty. The rival show, when it took on the Schiavo case, had used it as a vehicle to say something, to explore the ethics, to make an argument about the agonizing questions of life and death and who gets to decide. It used the tragedy as a doorway into a genuine, if crude, moral conversation. McFarlane's show, by contrast, offered a 3-minute musical number whose entire content was that this real, dead woman had been barely alive, had cost a lot of money, and was therefore a fitting subject for a cheerful little song. There was no argument in it, no exploration, no point beyond the mockery itself. The joke was the cruelty. The cruelty was the whole joke. And that is the line that so many people felt the show had crossed. The line between using a difficult subject to say something true and simply pointing at a grieving family's worst moment and laughing. This episode did not exist in isolation either. It came from a period when the show was leaning harder and harder into this kind of material, and the Schiavo number was part of a broader pattern that made even some longtime fans uneasy. Around the same stretch of the show's life, there were other moments that drew similar fire, including material handling domestic violence in ways that critics found not darkly comic, but genuinely disturbing, treating the suffering of a battered character as a source of humor rather than horror. The show had discovered, somewhere along the way, that shock produced a reaction, and that a reaction was a kind of success. And so it kept reaching for the most shocking possible target, and few targets are more shocking than a real woman's slow public death. Here is the darkest truth buried in this chapter, and it is not really about whether one musical number was funny or not. It is about what the show revealed about the relationship between comedy and power. When a show mocks the powerful, it is doing something old and honorable, puncturing the mighty, speaking truth to those who can defend themselves. But when a show mocks a woman who died unable to speak, who could not consent, who could not respond, whose family was still grieving, it is doing something else entirely. It is punching not up but straight down at the most defenseless subject imaginable, a dead woman who cannot object, and a family whose only crime was loving her too much to let her go quietly. And when the response to the outcry is not reflection but a complaint about double standards, it suggests a show that had lost the ability to tell the difference between courage and cruelty, that had come to believe that offending people was the same thing as being brave. The family kept fighting, kept advocating, kept trying to make sure their sister was remembered as a person rather than a punchline. But the episode aired, and it aired to millions, and it lives on in the vast library. One more small, permanent monument to the show's willingness to trade a real family's grief for a laugh. When you know the story behind it, the musical number does not play as edgy or transgressive anymore. It plays as sad and a little sickening, a reminder that behind every cheerful cartoon face on that screen, there were sometimes real people out in the world flinching at what they saw. Let that heaviness pass through you and out again, slowly. The next story is complicated in a different way, because it is one where the outrage came from the most powerful woman in the country at that moment, and where the person who fought back on the show's behalf was someone almost nobody expected, someone whose voice deserves to be heard more than any politician's. The Down syndrome episode and the woman who fought back. Not every dark truth about this show is a simple story of a cartoon being cruel and the world being right to condemn it. Some of them are genuinely tangled, the kind of story where the more you learn, the harder it becomes to decide who was in the right, where the person you expect to be the victim turns out to have a fierce and surprising voice of her own. This is one of those, and it centers on an episode about a young woman with Down syndrome, a furious response from one of the most famous political figures in the country, and a real actress who stepped into the middle of the storm and refused to be spoken for. The episode aired on Valentine's Day in 2010. The teenage son of the family goes on a date with a girl named Ellen, a classmate who has Down syndrome. The story, by the standards of this show, actually handled the relationship with a fair amount of care. The other characters did not simply mock Ellen for her disability. There was a musical number helping the boy get ready for the date. There was an arc in which the boy has to confront his own assumptions, admits that he had bought into a stereotype about what a person with Down syndrome would be like, and learns that Ellen is a full person with a personality all her own. In fact, Ellen turns out to be assertive, bossy, even a little domineering, which was itself a deliberate choice, a rejection of the sugary, one-dimensional way people with Down syndrome are usually portrayed, always gentle, always sweet, always inspirational. The writers gave her flaws and edges, treated her as a real character rather than a saintly symbol. But tucked into that episode was a single line, and it was that one line that set off a national firestorm. During the date, Ellen is asked about her family, and she mentions casually that her father is an accountant and her mother is the former governor of Alaska. In 2010, there was exactly one woman that description could point to. Sarah Palin had been the governor of Alaska, had been the Republican nominee for vice president in the previous election, and was at that moment one of the most talked about political figures in the country. And Sarah Palin had a young son named Trig who had been born with Down syndrome, a fact she had spoken about often and had made central to her public image as a champion of families with special needs children. So the line landed like a dart aimed straight at Palin. It implied that Ellen, this cartoon girl with Down syndrome, was Palin's daughter, and Palin took it as a direct attack on her real son and on her family, and she did not stay quiet. She responded on social media, describing the joke as a kick in the gut. Her daughter Bristol responded too, more sharply, calling the show's writers heartless and accusing them of thinking they were being clever by mocking her brother and her family and declaring that they had failed. Palin then took the fight onto television, appearing on a cable news program where she described the people who made the show as cruel and cold-hearted, and asked, pointedly, when enough would be enough, when society would finally be willing to say that some things simply are not funny. For a moment, it looked like a familiar story. A powerful, sympathetic mother defending her disabled child against a crude cartoon that had mocked him for a laugh. If that had been the whole story, it would sit comfortably alongside the Schiavo episode as another case of the show punching down at the vulnerable. But it was not the whole story, because of who had actually voiced the character of Ellen. The girl with Down syndrome had not been voiced by one of the show's regular cast members, putting on an exaggerated impression. She had been voiced by a real actress named Andrea Faye Friedman, and Andrea Faye Friedman herself had Down syndrome. This was not a case of able-bodied performers mocking a disability from the outside. The disabled character had been given a real disabled voice, an experienced actress who had built a genuine career in television over many years, appearing on well-known dramas, giving motivational talks around the world about living with Down syndrome. The show had cast authentically, choosing a woman who actually lived the experience the character represented, and that decision reframed the entire controversy. And Andrea Faye Friedman had something to say about Sarah Palin's outrage, and she said it in her own voice, on her own terms, and it was extraordinary. She made clear that she did not feel mocked. She had understood the joke perfectly well, better, she suggested, than Palin had. She explained that the joke was not aimed at people with Down syndrome at all. It was aimed at Sarah Palin. It was a piece of political satire, a jab at a politician, using a character who happened to share a trait with the politician's son. Friedman felt the point had sailed right over Palin's head. She remarked dryly that she guessed the former governor did not have a sense of humor. She said that in her own family they believed laughing was good, that her parents had raised her to have a sense of humor and to live a normal life. And then she delivered a line about Palin that was so pointed, so cutting, that it became the defining quote of the entire affair. She contrasted the way her own parents had treated her as a full and capable person with the way she felt Palin used her son, suggesting that Palin carried the boy around almost like a prop, holding him up in search of sympathy and votes rather than simply letting him live his life. Think about the reversal that just happened. The person everyone assumed was the helpless victim of the joke, the disabled character, turned out to be voiced by a confident, articulate, funny woman with Down syndrome who not only defended the joke, but used it as a launching pad to criticize the powerful politician who claimed to be defending her kind. She refused the role of victim entirely. She insisted on being a participant, an artist who understood exactly what she had helped make and stood behind it. She reframed herself, and people like her, as fully capable of sarcasm, of politics, of aggression, of humor, of everything that makes a person rather than an object of pity. In defending the episode, she was really defending a larger idea, the idea that people with Down syndrome are not fragile saints to be protected from every sharp word, but human beings who can take a joke, make a joke, and fire back at a politician who underestimates them. The show's creator defended the episode too, along familiar lines, describing his show as an equal opportunity offender, one that used satire as the foundation of its humor and did not carve out protected classes exempt from being teased. The writer of the episode made a characteristically flippant remark about deciding, after offending so many other kinds of people, to write something that would offend smart people for a change. And even a prominent television host weighed in on the show's side. So this was not the show standing alone against a righteous world. This was a genuinely divided situation, with a grieving mother of a disabled child on one side, and on the other side an accomplished disabled actress who felt she had been well served, along with the show that had cast her. Where does the darkness live in a story this tangled? It is not as simple as the earlier chapters. Part of it lives in the way a real child, Palin's actual son, became collateral in a fight between a cartoon and his mother, a small boy who had no say in any of it and who was used, by both sides in a way, as a symbol in a larger argument. Part of it lives in the uncomfortable truth that the show was, in this case, at least partly right, that it had done something more thoughtful and more inclusive than its critics gave it credit for, and yet it had done so with a needle deliberately aimed at a real family, wrapping a genuine act of authentic casting around a personal political jab. The show could not simply make its point about disability and inclusion. It had to also draw blood from a specific real person, and in doing so, it dragged that person's child into the crossfire. And there is a quiet sadness that has settled over this whole story with the passage of time, one that neither side could have seen coming back in 2010. Andrea Faye Friedman, the woman whose fierce, funny, self-possessed voice cut through all the noise and reframed the entire debate, died in December of 2023 in her early 50s. She had lived exactly the kind of full, accomplished, public life she insisted people like her were capable of. She had acted, she had spoken, she had traveled the world, she had refused to be anyone's symbol or anyone's victim. And when she died, the obituaries remembered her not as the girl in the cartoon, but as a woman who had built a real and pioneering career and who had, in her own way, expanded what the world believed a person with Down syndrome could be and do. In the end, her defense of that episode was of a piece with how she lived, an insistence on being taken seriously, on being allowed to be sharp and funny and fully human. It is worth remembering her that way, as the person who stood in the middle of a national controversy and, of everyone involved, spoke with the most clarity and the most self-respect. So this chapter does not resolve into a simple verdict, and maybe that is its own kind of truth about the show. It could be careless and cruel, as we have seen and will see again, but it could also occasionally stumble into something more complicated and more genuine, and the very same episode that enraged a politician could also give a real disabled actress the role of her career and a platform to say something that mattered. The darkness and the light were braided together so tightly that pulling them apart is nearly impossible. Both were real. Both were there in the same 22 minutes. Let your mind rest in that complexity for a while, in the discomfort of a story that will not simplify itself. And now let me take you to a place where the show's relationship with a marginalized group was far less defensible, where its own creator made grand promises about respect, and the show broke those promises, year after year, in ways that a great many people found impossible to forgive. Ida, Glad, and the jokes they promised to stop. There is a special kind of darkness in a promise that gets broken, especially when the promise was made publicly, with fanfare, framed as growth and maturity and moral progress, and then quietly betrayed episode after episode while the people it was made to kept getting hurt. This chapter is about that broken promise, and about a recurring character who became, for many people, the single clearest example of how this show treated a vulnerable group as a punchline for years, while insisting, all the while, that it was on their side. Let me start with the character, because she is at the center of it. Her name is Ida, and she is the parent of one of the show's main supporting characters, a neighbor who is one of the father's closest friends. In an episode in the 8th season, that neighbor's father comes back to town, a decorated military veteran, a war hero the son had always looked up to and admired. And during the visit, this father reveals a secret. He is transgender. She has decided to undergo gender-affirming surgery and to live, from then on, as a woman named Ida. Now, the intent behind this episode, according to the show's creator, was actually sympathetic. MacFarlane spoke about it before it aired with something close to pride. He said, in advance, that the transgender community would be very happy with it, that it might be the most sympathetic portrayal of a transgender character ever to appear on television. He genuinely seemed to believe that. He framed the whole thing as a story about acceptance, about a son learning that his parent was still the same brave, admirable person he had always respected, still a war hero, still someone worthy of love, just living her life in a different way. The core message the show intended was that you should accept people for who they are. That was the intent. The execution was another matter entirely, and it is the execution that people could not forgive. Because folded into this supposedly sympathetic episode was a sequence built around one of the family dog storylines. The dog, without knowing who she is, sleeps with Ida, and when he finds out afterward that the woman he was with is Ida, that she is transgender, the show has him react by vomiting. Not for a moment, not for a beat, but for a full 30 seconds, an extended, grotesque, unbroken display of violent disgust, played entirely for laughs. The joke being that discovering he had been intimate with a transgender woman was so nauseating that he could not stop retching. And around that central sequence were scattered other moments. Remarks from the parents of the family that many viewers read as openly contemptuous of Ida, treating her as something disgusting or absurd, food she had prepared being thrown away, that sort of thing. So here was the problem, laid bare. The show wanted credit for a sympathetic story about acceptance, and at the same time it built its biggest comedic set piece around the idea that a transgender woman's body is so revolting that mere contact with it makes a person violently ill for half a minute. Those two things could not coexist. You cannot claim to be delivering the most sympathetic transgender portrayal in television history, while your centerpiece joke is that sleeping with a transgender woman is the most disgusting thing imaginable. The message of acceptance and the vomit gag were pulling in opposite directions, and for the transgender viewers watching, the vomit gag was the part that landed, the part that stung, the part they had seen 1,000 times before in a culture that treated their existence as a punchline or a horror. The response was swift. The major media watchdog organization for the community released a statement saying it shared the serious concerns being voiced from within that community, and that it was taking those concerns directly to the network. A prominent critic who covered LGBTQ media at the time gave the episode a harsh review, noting that while it deserved some credit for making a few real points about transgender people, the vomiting scene and the contemptuous remarks were shockingly insensitive, so much so that the critic said he found it nearly impossible to reconcile the episode with the creator's grand claims about how sympathetic it was supposed to be. The conservative watchdog groups that always opposed the show attacked it too, from the opposite direction. It managed to offend nearly everyone, which the show sometimes wore as a badge of honor, but in this case, the offense to the transgender community specifically was the part that mattered and the part that lingered. MacFarlane defended it, and his defense is revealing. He expressed genuine surprise and even distress at the negative reaction, saying it always troubled him to hear that the gay community was upset with the show, because that was one group he had always hoped would know the show was on their side. He continued to insist that Ida was a sympathetic portrayal. And to defend the vomit gag specifically, he offered a comparison that many found telling, suggesting that the dog's reaction was simply the natural response of a heterosexual character to a certain discovery, the way, he said, a gay man might recoil at the sight of a woman's body. In other words, he framed the disgust as ordinary, as just how attraction works, rather than as anything hateful. Whether you find that persuasive or not, notice what it reveals. He genuinely did not see the vomiting for 30 seconds as an attack. To him, it was a joke about attraction. To a transgender person watching, it was one more confirmation that the world found their body nauseating. Years later, MacFarlane added another layer to the defense, one that complicates the picture in a way worth sitting with. He revealed that the episode had been shaped in significant part by a writer on the show who had lived through this exact experience in his own family, whose own parent had transitioned to living as a woman. So the story was not invented by strangers mocking something they did not understand. It came, at least in part, from someone writing about his own life, his own parent, his own attempt to make sense of loving a father who became a woman. That does not erase the harm of the vomit gag, but it does mean the episode was not simply careless outsider cruelty. It was, in a strange way, personal, a real person processing a real experience, filtered through the crude and often merciless comedic machinery of the show, which could not seem to tell a personal story without also reaching for the most shocking possible laugh. Here's where the broken promise comes in, and this is the part that turns the whole thing from a single bad episode into something more damning. Ida did not go away after that episode. She became a recurring character, and over the years that followed, the show kept bringing her back, and it kept using her as the engine for the same kind of jokes, the same reduction of a transgender woman to a source of disgust and mockery, sometimes reaching new depths of tastelessness that critics found genuinely hard to describe without wincing. The show had a chance, over and over, to do better with this character it claimed to have created out of sympathy, and over, it chose the crude joke. Then, at the start of 2019, the show made its promise. In an episode that featured a cartoon version of a certain president, the main character explicitly told that president that the show had been trying to phase out its gay jokes. It was a self-aware, meta moment, a wink at the audience, and it was not just a throwaway line. The show's executive producers confirmed it in interviews. They said the writers' room had evolved, that the show had been on the air for around 2 decades, that attitudes toward gay people had changed enormously in that time, and that some of the things they had felt comfortable joking about back in the mid-2000s were things they now understood were simply not acceptable. If you put an episode from the middle 2000s next to one from the late 2010s, they said, you would see the difference. It was presented as growth, as the show finally maturing, finally recognizing that a whole category of its humor had been built on cruelty toward gay people and deciding to leave that cruelty behind. And it was a real change, to a degree, when it came to the gay jokes specifically. But the promise, as many people quickly pointed out, had a gaping hole in it, and the hole was shaped exactly like Ida, because the transgender jokes did not stop. In the very same year that the show announced it was phasing out its gay humor, Ida returned in a new episode, and the show once again mined her transgender identity for cheap, lazy, mocking humor. A journalist who covered these issues wrote about it with weary frustration, noting that the show had vowed to change and then immediately demonstrated that when it came to transgender people, nothing had changed at all. The distinction the show seemed to be drawing was almost insulting in its precision. It would retire the gay jokes, which had become socially costly, while continuing to treat transgender people as fair game, as if trans lives sat in some lower tier that the new maturity did not need to reach. Now, to be fair, and this show's story almost always requires it to be fair, some of the later handling of Ida did soften. There were episodes where the character was written with more sympathy and more complexity, where she was allowed moments of dignity, where the war hero framing that MacFarlane had originally intended came through more clearly. The show was not a single unbroken line of cruelty toward this character. There were better episodes and worse ones. And MacFarlane himself later demonstrated, on a completely different show he created, a science fiction series, that he was capable of handling questions of gender identity with real thoughtfulness and nuance when he chose to, telling a story about gender that was widely praised for its kindness and depth. So the capacity for care was there. He could do it. He proved he could do it. Which makes the persistence of the vomit gag approach on the cartoon feel less like ignorance and more like a choice. A decision that on this particular show, in this particular comedic register, the crude joke would keep winning. The darkest truth of this chapter runs deeper than a show simply making offensive jokes about transgender people. The deeper truth is what surrounded those jokes. The show told the world it had grown. It told the world it now understood which jokes were unacceptable, that it had matured past a whole category of its own cruelty. And then it turned around and kept making those exact jokes about the one group it had apparently decided did not count, as though the transgender people in its audience simply fell outside the borders of the newfound conscience it had announced with such fanfare. A promise of progress became a way of drawing a new, narrower line, of saying we have learned to respect these people over here while continuing to laugh at those people over there. For the transgender viewers who had heard the announcement and dared to hope, the return of the same old Ida jokes was its own small betrayal, a reminder that the show's newfound conscience had very specific and convenient limits. The show wanted the credit for evolving, without paying the full cost of actually evolving. And that gap, between the promise and the practice, between the sympathy the creator claimed and the disgust the show kept performing, is one of the more quietly dispiriting truths in this whole long story. Breathe slowly now, and let that tension ease out of you. We are moving now toward the moments when the world outside the screen fought back in the most concrete ways it could, with government bans and lawsuits and organized campaigns, the times when real institutions and real people decided this show had gone too far and tried, in their various ways, to make it stop. When the real world fought back, for most of its life, this show existed in a kind of protected bubble, insulated by the enormous machine of American broadcasting, free to provoke and offend with little real consequence beyond angry letters and bad reviews. But every so often, the real world reached back through the screen and tried to do something about it. Sometimes it was a foreign government. Sometimes it was a beloved elderly comedian with a good lawyer. Sometimes it was an organized army of parents. The show survived all of these attacks, but the stories of the attacks themselves tell you just how far the show pushed and how many different kinds of people it managed to enrage along the way. Let me begin with the government of an entire nation, because it is the most surreal of these stories. In 2009, the show aired an episode in which the family dog, arrested for possession of marijuana, launches a passionate campaign to legalize the drug, complete with a cheerful musical number extolling the virtues of a bag of weed. It was, by the show's standards, a fairly typical episode, one more foray into a provocative subject wrapped in a catchy song. But it did not play as typical everywhere in the world. In Venezuela, then under the government of President Hugo Chavez, the episode became a genuine political matter. The country's justice minister publicly denounced the show. He declared that it promoted the use of marijuana, that it was, in effect, propaganda for drug consumption, and he framed it within a larger political grievance, suggesting that these adult American cartoons were mouthpieces for a permissive American attitude toward drugs that was fueling the drug trade and harming his country. This was not idle complaining. The government threatened to fine any cable station that continued to broadcast the show. It was an actual state ban, enforced with the threat of real financial penalties, aimed at a cartoon about a talking dog. One local station, rather than risk the fine, replaced the show in its schedule with an old episode of a completely different American series, a beach lifeguard drama, and ran public service films as a kind of apology. In a strange bit of history, that same beach drama had already been used once before as a substitute when another famous American cartoon had run afoul of the authorities in that country. So there was now a pattern, a government reaching up and yanking American cartoons off the air and dropping in lifeguards to fill the gap. And the timing of the Venezuelan uproar collided with another moment that made the show look even worse on the world stage. Around that same period, at a major awards ceremony, a clip from the show had been featured that showed the baby character brutally beating the family dog, bashing him into a bloody pulp and flushing his head down a toilet. Viewers who saw that clip out of context were revolted, describing it as disgusting rather than funny. So, in the span of a very short window, the show was being banned by a foreign government for promoting drug use and being held up internationally as an example of gratuitous, ugly violence. It was a bad stretch for the show's global reputation, a moment when the darkness that its defenders usually described as clever satire looked, to a lot of the watching world, simply grim. Now let me turn to the beloved elderly comedian, because this story has a sweetness to it even in the conflict, and it reveals something about how the show treated the legends who came before it. There was a woman named Carol Burnett, one of the most cherished figures in the history of American television comedy, whose own variety show had run for over a decade and had made her a national treasure. One of her most famous creations was a character called the Charwoman, a sweet, daydreaming cleaning lady in a bonnet with a mop and bucket, a character so iconic that her costume ended up in a national museum. In the fourth season, the show used that character. In an episode set partly in an adult bookstore, one of the characters reassures another that the shop is clean because, he says, Carol Burnett works there part-time as a janitor, and the camera reveals a cartoon version of the Charwoman mopping the floor of the pornographic store. The show also used an altered version of Burnett's own theme music and had the character perform Burnett's signature gesture, a little tug on the ear that she was famous for using to sign off her show, a private message to her grandmother. The whole thing lasted only a matter of seconds, well under half a minute. Carol Burnett was not amused. She had in fact previously declined to license her music to the show, and she felt that they had gone ahead and used her beloved creation anyway, dropping her sweet cleaning lady into a filthy setting without her permission. She sued. She filed a lawsuit against the studio for a sum in the millions, alleging copyright infringement and a violation of her rights over her own publicity and image. For a woman who had spent her career making people laugh, who had herself built a career partly on parody and gentle mockery of others, the decision to take a comedy show to court was a serious statement. It meant she felt a real line had been crossed, that turning her innocent, museum-worthy character into a porn shop janitor was not parody but degradation. The studio was taken aback, publicly expressing surprise that a woman who had made a career of spoofing others would sue over a brief bit of comedy. And in the end, the law sided with the show, though not because the judge thought the joke was kind. A federal judge dismissed the case, ruling that parody is protected under the freedoms guaranteed by the Constitution, and observing, in a line that captures the whole modern condition, that public figures like Burnett are frequent targets of parody and crude innuendo, and that in the new media landscape almost all self-imposed restraint had disappeared. So the show won on principle, the principle that even mean, crude parody of a beloved figure is legally protected speech. But Burnett had made her point, and the story lingers as a reminder that this show was willing to reach back and drag even the gentlest icons of comedy's past through the mud for a 5-second laugh, and that at least one of those icons had the standing and the will to stand up and say no. And then there were the parents. Throughout the show's entire existence, from its very first season, there was an organized watchdog group devoted to policing decency on television, and this show was one of its favorite and most frequent targets. Over the years, this group named the show the worst program on television more times than almost anyone could count on dozens upon dozens of occasions. It launched letter-writing campaigns urging the network to cancel the show. It filed complaints with the federal agency that regulates broadcasting, trying to bring the weight of government indecency rules down on the show's content. It compiled reports specifically cataloging what it saw as the show's relentless mockery of religion and its steady stream of violent and sexual imagery. For this group, the show was not edgy entertainment but a genuine cultural poison, and they treated fighting it as something close to a moral mission. MacFarlane's response to this group was, characteristically, to escalate rather than de-escalate. He did not try to placate them or find common ground. In an interview, he compared receiving their criticism to receiving hate mail from one of the most infamous mass murderers in human history. He described the members of the group as terrible people, said he had read their newsletter and visited their website and found them rotten to the core, and pointed out the irony that an organization priding itself on Christian values seemed, in his view, to spend its days hating people, before inviting them, in the crudest possible terms, to perform an act upon him. It was a scorched earth reply, deliberately offensive, calculated to enrage the very group that was trying to shut him down. And it worked, in the sense that it deepened the feud and generated more attention, which the show always converted into fuel. The complaints were not always coming from professional watchdogs either. Sometimes the outcry came from the exact communities the show had wounded. In one early episode, a cutaway gag featured a barbershop quartet singing and dancing merrily around the bed of a man dying of AIDS, joyfully informing him of his diagnosis in song. When that aired, it drew immediate and furious backlash, including protests from organizations that served people living with AIDS, People who had watched friends and loved ones die of the disease and did not find a chirpy musical number about a fatal diagnosis to be a laughing matter. This was a recurring dynamic. The show would reach for the most shocking possible juxtaposition: cheerfulness laid over death, a song laid over suffering, and some group of real people who had actually lived through that suffering would look up and feel the sting of being turned into a bit. There is even a smaller, stranger story from this long history of conflict that captures the show's occasional hypocrisy. At one point, the show included in an episode a piece of footage lifted from an old video that an ordinary person had posted online, a clip capturing a glitch in a decades-old video game. When the episode aired containing that borrowed footage, the automated systems that police copyright online flagged the original video, the real one, the one the ordinary person had made, and took it down, treating the genuine creator as if he were the thief who had stolen from the show, when in truth the show had helped itself to his footage. It took a public backlash before the original video was restored, and the studio issued an apology. It is a tiny episode in the grand scheme of things, but it is a perfect little emblem of a show that would freely borrow and parody and lift from everyone and everything, that would defend its right to do so all the way to federal court, and that would nonetheless, through the vast automated machinery it was plugged into, occasionally crush the small creators it had borrowed from. The powerful machine took what it wanted, and when the little person got caught in the gears, it took a fight to set things right. Add all of this up, and you get a portrait of a show at war with the world on multiple fronts at once. Foreign governments banned it. Comedy legends sued it. Parents groups campaigned to kill it. Disease charities protested it. Religious organizations condemned it. And through all of it, the show not only survived but often thrived, converting each new controversy into publicity, each new enemy into proof of its own transgressive credentials. That is the darkest truth of this chapter, in a way. The show did far more than merely endure the outrage aimed at it. It fed on that outrage, absorbed it, converted it directly into fuel. Every ban, every lawsuit, every campaign to shut it down became one more reason for people to seek it out, one more headline, one more moment of relevance, one more proof of the transgressive reputation the show wore like armor. The attacks were real, and the pain behind some of them was real, and the show absorbed all of it and turned it into fuel, growing stronger on the very anger it provoked. You cannot starve a thing that eats outrage by feeding it more outrage. And the world, again and again, fed it. Let your body sink a little deeper now, wherever you are resting. We have seen what the show did and how the world responded. Now we turn to the quieter, colder question underneath all of it. The question of why the show simply never stops, why it keeps going year after year, decade after decade, long past the point where even its own creator seems to fully believe in it. The business behind the curtain. We have spent a long time now in the shadows of specific episodes and specific controversies, and if you have been listening closely, you may have noticed a single word surfacing again and again beneath all of them. Money. The show came back from cancellation because of money. The banned abortion episode was buried because of money. The show fed on controversy because controversy generated attention, and attention was money. And now we arrive at the deepest and most fundamental of the dark truths, the one that explains why the show simply never ends, why it keeps going long after even its own creator has stopped fully believing in it. The truth is that at some point the show stopped being primarily a creative work and became primarily a financial machine. And financial machines do not stop running just because they have stopped saying anything. To understand this, you have to understand what happened to the man at the center of it. In the early years, MacFarlane was everywhere in the show, hands deep in every part of it, guiding the writing, shaping the tone, voicing the central characters, holding the whole thing together with a clear, personal vision. But around 2011 and 2012, something shifted. He made his first feature film, a comedy about a foul-mouthed living teddy bear, and it became an enormous hit, earning many hundreds of millions of dollars worldwide. And as he pursued that film and the wave of new opportunities that followed it, he stepped back from the daily creative work of the cartoon. He has said this plainly himself. He explained that there was a point, around a dozen years into the show's run, when he actually thought they should wrap it up while it was still relatively young and strong, and that when he went off to make that first film, that was the moment he disengaged from the writer's room. He handed the day-to-day running of the show to other people. He kept voicing his characters, kept lending his name and his voice, but the creative steering passed into other hands. And listen to how he described his own philosophy about the lifespan of a show, because it is one of the most quietly damning things anyone connected to the series has ever said. He stated flatly that no show is at its creative peak past its 7th season. No show, he included his own. He acknowledged, in effect, that the vast majority of the episodes ever made, the enormous bulk of the series, everything from roughly the halfway point onward, existed on the far side of the show's creative peak, in the long, slow decline that he considered simply the natural fate of any long-running program. He compared it to a comfort, to a tradition, to characters who become people you feel at ease having in your home each week, regardless of whether the writing is any good. This is the creator of the show telling you that it is not about greatness anymore. It is about comfort, familiarity, the warm background hum of characters you have known for decades. He was honest about it. He did not pretend the show was still reaching for the heights. He said it changes into something else, and he was at peace with that. So if the creative peak was long past, and the creator himself said so, why does it keep going? The answer is written in the numbers, and the numbers tell a strange, two-sided story. On one side, the traditional television audience for the show has collapsed almost completely. Remember where it started. The very first episode, riding the enormous crowd left over from the Super Bowl, pulled in something like 22 million viewers. That was the peak. In its early revival years in the mid-2000s, it still commanded a robust audience in the range of just several million viewers a week. But over the decades that followed, that broadcast audience eroded and eroded and eroded. By recent seasons, the number of people watching a new episode on traditional television had fallen to somewhere around 1.5 million on a given week, from 22 million to around 1.5 million. That is a staggering collapse. The loss of the overwhelming majority of the show's original broadcast audience, a slow bleed spread across so many years that most people never noticed it happening. The network's own treatment of the show reflected this decline in a way that anyone in the television industry would immediately recognize as a demotion. For most of its life, the show aired on Sunday nights, in the heart of the network's celebrated animation lineup, the prime real estate of the broadcast week, sitting alongside the other big animated comedies. Sunday night was where the network put the shows it was proud of. But as newer programs demanded space and the show's numbers softened, it was pushed out of that Sunday lineup and relocated to Wednesday nights, paired with a live-action series airing on a quieter weekday where expectations are lower and audiences smaller. In the language of television, being moved from the flagship Sunday block to a random Wednesday slot is not a promotion. It is the network gently signaling that you are no longer a headliner, that you have become a piece of reliable, unglamorous furniture in the schedule. And yet, here is the other side of the story, the side that explains everything. Even as the traditional broadcast audience crumbled, the show became a colossus in a completely different arena. On streaming services, the show is not a fading relic. It is a titan. It has ranked among the most streamed programs anywhere, with audiences consuming it not by the million, but by the billions of minutes of viewing time in single weeks, hundreds of millions of minutes week after week, placing it among the most-watched series on the platforms that carry it. The vast library of episodes, built up over more than 2 decades, has become an enormous, endlessly rewatchable comfort archive that people put on in the background of their lives, again and again, day after day, all over the world. The linear broadcast number, the 1.5 million, is almost a rounding error next to the true scale of how much the show is actually being consumed. It has quietly become one of the most watched things in the world, just not in the old-fashioned way that the ratings measure. Now you can see the whole machine. This is why the show never ends. The traditional audience does not matter the way it used to, because the show's real value now lives in reruns, in streaming, in merchandise, in the endless global rewatching of that gigantic library. It is astonishingly cheap to produce compared to live-action television. There are no expensive sets, no large casts of on-screen actors, no location shoots. A handful of voice performers record their lines, the animation is produced overseas at relatively low cost, and out the other end comes a product that feeds the streaming platforms, sells merchandise, and remains a recognizable global brand. As long as that entire ecosystem keeps generating money, and it generates a great deal of money, the show will be kept alive, regardless of whether any given new episode is any good, regardless of whether the creative peak passed 15 years ago, regardless of what anyone thinks of it. And so, in the spring of 2025, the show's future was locked in with an enormous deal. Its corporate parent, the same entertainment giant that now owns so much of the old studio's output, renewed the show for 4 more seasons all at once, a mega deal that would carry it forward for years into the future, all the way through the television season that would coincide with the show's 30th anniversary. 4 more seasons guaranteed, years in advance, at a time when the traditional audience had shrunk to a fraction of what it once was. The show was not renewed because a wave of creative excitement had swept through the writer's room. It was renewed because the business case was overwhelming, because a cheap-to-produce, endlessly rewatched, globally recognized brand is a machine for making money, and you do not switch off a machine that is making money. MacFarlane, for his part, has been candid about how he now thinks of the show, and his candor is the final piece of this dark truth. In interviews, he has framed the show's continued existence not in terms of burning creative passion, but in terms of utility. He has spoken about the fact that people still enjoy it, that it still makes people happy, that it can help fund things he cares about out in the world. He has talked about the show reaching a kind of escape velocity, the point at which it has been going for so long that there is no natural reason to stop it, no logical endpoint, unless and until the audience simply stops caring. There was no talk of thrilling new stories he could not wait to tell. There was a calm, practical acceptance that the thing exists, that it works, that it pays, and that there is no reason to end it. Compare that, for a moment, to the young man we met at the very beginning of our journey, the one who nearly died on a plane, who then poured everything he had into a fragile 15-minute pilot, bursting with ideas, desperate to bring this world to life. That young man had a vision. He had something he was trying to say. He fought for the show when the network kept trying to kill it. And somewhere across the decades, that fire cooled into something else, into stewardship of a valuable asset, into the calm management of a brand that runs on its own momentum. There is nothing evil in that. It is a completely reasonable way to feel about a show you created a quarter of a century ago. But it is a very different energy, and it explains, more than any single controversy, why the later show feels the way it feels. When the creative heart of a thing comes to see it primarily as a reliable engine of revenue rather than as a work of art, the art quietly recedes, and the engine keeps running, and the thing goes on, and on, and on. That is perhaps the darkest truth of all, and the least dramatic. There is no scandal in it, no villain, no banned episode, no furious family. It is simply the quiet fact that a beloved creative work can outlive its own soul, can keep producing new episodes long after the reason for making it has changed from passion to profit, can become a kind of ghost of itself, wandering the schedule, still wearing the same familiar face, still speaking in the same familiar voices, generating money in the background while the world half watches out of habit. The show did not die when its creative peak passed. It could not die because it had become too useful to be allowed to, and so it lives on, an immortal machine, kept running not by love but by the ledgers, and that immortality is its own strange and melancholy kind of darkness. Let all of that settle over you softly like a blanket. But money was not the only force pulling at the show from behind the scenes. There was also the long, uneasy relationship between the man who made it and the network that carried it, a relationship that broke into open conflict during the great writers' strikes and revealed, in the plainest possible terms, who really held the power over the thing he had created. The strike and the rift. For all the darkness we have explored, there is one story that shows the show's creator in a genuinely admirable light, and it is worth telling, both because fairness demands it and because it reveals something important about the machinery he was caught inside. It is the story of what happened when the writers of American television went on strike, and where MacFarlane chose to stand, and what the network did to his show while his back was turned. To understand it, you have to understand the position writers occupy in the entertainment industry, which is, in a word, precarious. The writers are the people who actually create the stories, the jokes, the characters, the words that everything else is built on. And yet, historically, they have often been among the least fairly compensated people in the whole apparatus, especially when it comes to the money that flows from reruns, from home video, from the new streaming platforms. The afterlife of the work they created. Time and again, the writers watched enormous fortunes get made from their labor while their own share stayed small. And time and again, the only real weapon they had was to put down their pens all at once and refuse to work until they were treated more fairly. That is exactly what happened in the late autumn of 2007. The Writers Guild of America went on strike, thousands of television and film writers walking off the job together, shutting down production across the entire industry in a fight for a fairer share of the money their work generated, particularly the money from home video and the emerging world of digital distribution. It was a massive industry-wide work stoppage, and it brought scripted television to a grinding halt. Shows ran out of scripts, productions froze, seasons were cut short across the board. And here is where MacFarlane made his choice, the choice that reflects well on him. He did not quietly keep working. He did not find some loophole to protect his own valuable show while his fellow writers walked the picket lines. He joined them. He was a writer himself, a member of the Guild, and he stood with the Guild. He walked off his own show in solidarity. He refused to complete any more episodes until the strike was resolved. He put himself and his enormously profitable series on the line for the principle that writers deserve to be paid fairly. And he did it not just once. When another great strike came years later, in the early 2020s, he did the same thing again, walking off his shows alongside the other showrunners in support of the writers, consistent in his position across the decades, standing on the picket line both times rather than crossing it. Whatever else you make of the man, that consistency, that willingness to risk his own fortune for the people who made the same kind of work he did, is genuinely to his credit. But now comes the darker half of the story, the half that reveals the true power structure underneath the whole enterprise. When MacFarlane walked off his show in that first strike, the network faced a problem. Several episodes of his cartoon were nearly finished, most of the work done, only the final touches remaining. And those final touches were exactly the kind of work MacFarlane was refusing to do in solidarity with the strike. So the network made a decision. They decided to finish and air those episodes anyway, without him, without his final approval, without his input on the last stages of the work. They took his show, the show he had created and nearly died to make possible, and they put it on the air over his objections, while he stood outside on the picket line. MacFarlane was furious, and understandably so. He acknowledged, with a kind of bitter honesty, that the network was legally allowed to do this, that his contract gave them the right, but he did not hide how he felt about it. He called the network's move, in a memorable and blunt phrase, a colossal act of disrespect, warning that they had never done anything like it before, and that it would genuinely damage his relationship with them if they went through with it. They went through with it anyway. By the time the strike ended in the early part of the following year, the network had already aired multiple episodes of his show without any input from him at all. His season was gutted, cut down to a fraction of its intended length, and several of its episodes had been pushed onto the air in a form he had not signed off on. Sit with what that reveals, because it is one of the clearest windows in this whole long story into who actually holds the power. Here was the creator of the show, the man whose name was on it, the man whose voice literally spoke for its central characters, the man without whom none of it would exist. And when he took a principled stand and stepped away, the machine simply rolled over him. It took his creation, finished it without him, and broadcast it against his express wishes. And it was all perfectly legal, because somewhere along the way he had signed a contract, and the contract said that the show did not really belong to him in the way that mattered. It belonged to the network, to the studio, to the corporate structure that owned the rights. He could create it, he could voice it, he could pour his life into it, and still, when he tried to withhold his labor for the sake of his fellow writers, the owners could take the thing from his hands and run it without him. This is the darkness that underlies the entire industry, laid bare in a single episode. The people who make the art do not own the art. The people who own the art can, when it suits them, make it without the people who create it. The show that had come back from the dead on the strength of its fans' love, the show that carried its creator's vision and voice, could be produced against that creator's will the moment he became inconvenient. The strike did not just shorten a season. It exposed the fundamental power imbalance at the heart of the whole enterprise, the fact that even the most successful, most powerful creator in animation was, in the end, a hired hand, subject to a contract that let the owners override him whenever they chose. There is a further, quieter cost to all of this, and it has to do with the show itself. A strike does not just delay a production, it shatters the delicate creative rhythm that a show depends on. Television writing runs on momentum, on rooms full of people building stories weeks and months in advance, keeping the whole machine in motion. When that machine is frozen for months, and then episodes are forced out without their creators' involvement, and then the whole thing has to lurch back into motion afterward, something is lost that is hard to fully recover. The rhythm breaks. The continuity phrase, some of the people drift away, and a show that was already, by its creator's own later admission, past its creative peak, absorbs one more disruption, one more blow to the fragile ecosystem that produces good work, and comes out the other side a little more tired, a little more mechanical, a little further from what it once was. So the strike story is really two dark truths braided together. One is bright at its core, the story of a creator who did the right thing, who stood with the workers, who risked his own fortune for a principle, and who deserves genuine credit for it. The other is bleak, the story of what the owners did to his show the moment he stepped away, and what that revealed about how little the creator of even a beloved cultural phenomenon truly controls the thing he made. The man who nearly died to bring the show into the world could be pushed aside from it whenever the money required, and no amount of fame or success or creative ownership could change that. He had made the thing, and the thing was not his, and when he tried to stand on principle, the machine simply reached past him and kept running. Let that settle into the quiet with all the rest. We have seen the money underneath the show and the power structure underneath the money. Now let me take you to the show's most bitter rivalry, and to a question that has haunted it since almost the beginning. The question of whether its comedy has any soul in it at all, or whether it, as its harshest critics once claimed, something closer to random noise. The rivalry and the manatees. Among all the enemies this show made over its long life, foreign governments and watchdog groups and grieving families and offended comedians, there was one rival that cut deeper than any of them, because this rival did not attack the show's content or its morals. This rival attacked its soul. It accused the show, in front of millions of people, of being fundamentally empty, of producing comedy that required no thought, no craft, no genuine wit at all, and it did so in a way so precise and so devastating that the accusation has followed the show ever since, whispered by critics and fans for years afterward. That rival was another animated comedy, a cruder, sharper, more openly political show that had long positioned itself as the show's natural enemy. The two shows had circled each other for years, but the real blow came in a two-part episode the rival aired in the middle 2000s, an episode built specifically as an attack on McFarlane's show and everything it stood for. The creators of the rival show had never hidden their contempt. They found the show's style of comedy lazy, and they decided to say so in the loudest possible way by building an entire storyline around dismantling it. And the image they chose to make their point has become legendary, one of the most memorable pieces of comedy criticism ever produced by a comedy show. They depicted the writing of McFarlane's show as being produced not by human beings at all, but by manatees, gentle sea creatures, floating in a tank, nudging around large balls, each ball printed with a random word or concept. According to the rival show's brutal parody, the way jokes got written was that the manatees would randomly bump these idea balls together, and whatever combination they happened to knock into the chute would become the next cutaway gag. A word, a random noun, a piece of pop culture, all shoved together by aquatic mammals with no thought and no intention. The joke, the devastating heart of it, was that the comedy was so disconnected and so random that it did not matter which combination came out, because none of them meant anything. None of them connected to the story or the characters, and any one of them could be swapped for any other without changing a thing. It was an accusation that landed with real force because it named something that critics had been circling for a long time. The heart of the criticism was about those cutaway gags, the show's signature device, the sudden jumps away from the story to some unrelated joke. In small doses, used with craft, those cutaways could be genuinely funny, But as the show leaned on them harder and harder, they came to feel, to the show's detractors, like exactly what the rival was mocking: interchangeable, random, disconnected fragments with no relationship to anything around them. The rival show was arguing that this was not really comedy at all in the traditional sense, not the careful construction of setup and payoff, of character and situation, but rather a kind of random noise generator dressed up as a cartoon, a machine for producing pop culture references that could be assembled in any order by anyone or by no one, by manatees. And here is the detail that reveals how much this criticism stung and how widely it was shared even by people you might not expect. After that rival episode aired, its creators reportedly received phone calls of thanks from writers on other, more respected animated shows, writers on the long-running Yellow-Skinned family comedy and on the gentle Texas Set animated series, quietly reaching out to express their gratitude for someone finally saying out loud what they had apparently been thinking. That is a remarkable thing to sit with. The criticism was not coming only from a rival with an axe to grind. It resonated inside the animation industry itself, among the very people who made competing shows, some of whom apparently felt that McFarlane's show had gotten away with something, had achieved enormous success on the back of a style of comedy they considered beneath the craft. McFarlane, for his part, wrestled with how to respond, and the story of his non-response is itself revealing. He considered hitting back. His writers apparently developed material aimed at the rival show, including a joke that would have taken a shot at the rival's creators, placing them in a crude and unflattering setting. But in the end, that particular jab was cut, deemed too tasteless even for a show that prided itself on tastelessness, and McFarlane ultimately decided against launching a full counterattack. He concluded, more or less, that his show did not have the time to waste feuding with the rival. Whether that was genuine indifference or a quiet acknowledgement that the criticism had landed somewhere tender, it is hard to say. But there is something telling in a show famous for never backing down from a fight, choosing, in this one case, to mostly let the blow go unanswered. Now, the criticism was not entirely fair, and it is worth saying so, because the truth is more complicated than the manatee joke allowed. The show, at its best, especially in those early seasons and in scattered later high points, was capable of genuine brilliance, of tightly constructed episodes with real emotional weight, of jokes that were sharp and specific and clearly the product of talented writers working hard. There were episodes built entirely around character, with barely a cutaway in sight, that stand among the most acclaimed things the show ever produced, proving that the talent was there and that the show could tell a real story when it chose to. The manatee criticism was a caricature, and like all caricatures, it exaggerated one feature until it swallowed the whole face. The show was not only random noise, it was capable of much more. But here is why the criticism has endured anyway, why it still gets repeated all these years later, and why it belongs in a catalog of the show's darker truths. The manatee joke stuck because it named a real temptation that the show gave in to more and more as the years went on. When you have a device like the cutaway gag, a device that lets you drop any joke anywhere without needing it to connect to the story, you have handed yourself a shortcut. And shortcuts are seductive. Why do the hard work of building a story that generates its own humor, of developing characters whose interactions are funny, of constructing careful setups and satisfying payoffs, when you can simply have a character say a trigger line and cut away to a random gag that fills the time and gets a laugh? The manatee accusation was really an accusation about that shortcut, about the slow substitution of a machine for a craft, of interchangeable parts for genuine storytelling. And the reason it stung, and the reason it endured, is that there was enough truth in it to draw blood. There is even a way in which the show, in its later years, seemed to quietly concede the point. It became increasingly fond of a particular kind of joke, the joke that goes on far too long, the gag stretched out well past the point of humor, a character holding an injured knee and groaning for 30 or 40 seconds, a moment of nothing repeated until the sheer endurance of it became the supposed joke. There was a whole running bit, notorious among fans, in which the show would abandon comedy altogether for an extended stretch and simply play a full musical performance by an old country singer, no punchline, no twist, just the show filling airtime with someone else's song while the audience waited for it to end. To its defenders, these were bold experiments in anti-comedy, in defying the audience's expectations. To its critics, They were the manatees made manifest, proof that the show had run so short of actual jokes that it would rather run out the clock than write another one. When a show starts filling its own runtime with other people's songs and jokes that consist of nothing happening for a full minute, the accusation that its comedy is empty stops sounding like an insult and starts sounding like a description. So, the rivalry gave the show its most enduring wound. Not a wound to its reputation for decency, which was already in tatters and which the show wore proudly, but a wound to its reputation for craft, for artistry, for having a soul underneath the shock. The manatees became a permanent shorthand, a way for anyone to dismiss the show in a single image. Floating creatures bumping idea balls together, comedy without a mind behind it. And the deepest darkness in it is not that the accusation was true, because it was not entirely true, but that the show, over its long decline, kept providing new evidence for it, kept reaching for the shortcut, kept giving its critics more ammunition, until the caricature and the reality drew closer and closer together. A show can survive being called offensive. It can even thrive on it. But being called empty, being told that your comedy could be produced by animals randomly knocking words together, that is a harder thing to shake, and this show never fully shook it. Breathe and let that one drift away. We are near the end now. There is one more region of darkness to walk through before we come to rest, and it is the darkness woven into the comedy itself, the specific recurring things the show chose to laugh at, the cruelties it built into its very structure and returned to, week after week, year after year, as if they were nothing at all, the neighbor and the things we laughed at. Up to now, most of the dark truths we have explored lived in specific moments. A single banned episode, a single furious family, a single controversy that flared and faded. But some of the darkness in this show was not a moment at all. It was a permanent fixture. It was baked into the recurring furniture of the series, returned to again and again, presented so casually and so often that audiences grew numb to it, laughed along, and rarely stopped to ask what exactly they were laughing at. This chapter is about that quieter, more insidious kind of darkness, the cruelty that became so normal it stopped registering as cruelty at all. Let me begin with the neighbor, because he is the clearest and most uncomfortable example. Among the recurring residents of the family's little town is an elderly man, frail and soft-voiced, who lives near the Griffins. And this character was written, from the beginning, as a predator. His entire comedic function, the reason he exists in the show, is his open and persistent sexual obsession with the family's teenage son, a boy. That is the joke. That is what the character is for. Over the years, across many episodes, the show returned to this well again and again, mining the spectacle of an old man lusting after a child for laughs, treating a figure who would in the real world be a monster, a danger, a subject of criminal investigation, as a source of gentle, recurring comedy, almost a lovable eccentric. Sit with how strange and dark that actually is, once you step outside the familiar rhythm of the show and look at it clearly. This is a mainstream, wildly popular, primetime entertainment product that took the idea of an adult sexually pursuing a child and turned it into a running gag, a friendly little bit the audience was invited to chuckle at week after week. The character's menace was defanged by the softness of his voice and the absurdity of the presentation, packaged so that viewers would find him funny rather than horrifying. And it worked, in the sense that millions of people did laugh, did come to regard him as just another quirky face in the ensemble, did absorb, without quite noticing, the normalization of something genuinely monstrous. Critics and viewers who thought about it seriously found this one of the show's most indefensible choices, and it is not hard to see why. There is a real difference between joking about a dark subject to expose it or condemn it, and simply presenting a predator as a lovable, recurring character whose predation is the ongoing punchline. The show, for a very long time, did the second thing, and did it comfortably, and the audience went along. That neighbor is the sharpest example, but he is not alone. He is one symptom of a larger pattern, the show's habit of taking the most disturbing possible material and rendering it comfortable through sheer repetition and casualness. And once you start noticing the pattern, you see it everywhere in the show's later years, this steady practice of laying cheerfulness over horror, of treating cruelty as if it were nothing, of inviting the audience to relax and laugh at things that, examined coldly, are not funny at all but grim. Part of what made this work, What allowed the darkness to slip past the audience's defenses was the very nature of animation and comedy together. When something is drawn rather than filmed, when it happens to cartoon characters with round eyes and simple faces, it feels weightless, consequence-free, not quite real. And when it is wrapped in the familiar comedic rhythm of a show you have watched for years, presented with the same music and the same timing as every other joke, your mind files it as comedy before you have really considered its content. The show understood this, whether consciously or not, and it used that weightlessness as a kind of permission, a way to go places that live action could never go, to make jokes about subjects that would be unthinkable with real actors and real faces. The cartoon frame was a shield, and behind that shield the show could smuggle in material of genuine darkness and have the audience receive it as light entertainment. There is a deeper question lurking underneath all of this, and it is uncomfortable, so let us approach it gently. What does it mean that a mass audience laughed? Not the writers, not the network, not the creator, but the millions of ordinary people who watched, who found these things funny, who tuned in week after week and chuckled at the predatory neighbor and the casual cruelty and the horror dressed as comedy. It would be easy and comforting to place all the blame on the show, to treat the audience as innocent victims of the writer's choices. But comedy is a transaction. A joke only survives if people laugh at it. The predatory neighbor kept coming back for so many years because he got laughs, because the audience rewarded his return with the response that keeps a bit alive. The show reached for these dark places in part because the reaching worked, because there was an audience ready and willing to be shocked and to enjoy being shocked. The darkness was not only in the show, it was in the meeting point between the show and the millions of people who happily consumed it. And that is perhaps the most unsettling truth in this whole chapter. The show held up a mirror, and a great many of us looked into it and laughed. It normalized things that should have stayed shocking, and we let it, because the normalization was comfortable, because it is easier to laugh than to flinch, because the familiar rhythm of a beloved show lulls the conscience into going along. The predatory neighbor is funny to a lot of people precisely because the show trained them over years to find him funny, to receive him as an eccentric rather than a horror. That training is a kind of quiet moral erosion, a slow wearing away of the instinct to recoil, and it happened not through any single dramatic episode but through the patient repetition of casual cruelty, week after week, season after season, until the shocking became ordinary and the ordinary became invisible. This is why the recurring darkness is, in some ways, more troubling than the loud controversies. The banned episodes and the furious families at least provoked a reaction. Someone noticed. Someone objected. Someone said this has gone too far. But the predatory neighbor provoked mostly laughter, year after year, and the casual cruelty woven through the show's structure mostly slid by unremarked, absorbed into the background hum of a comedy people loved. The loud darkness got resisted, the quiet darkness got laughed at, and being laughed at, it endured, and enduring, it shaped, in some small way, the sensibilities of everyone who watched. None of this is to say that dark comedy is wrong, or that nothing should ever be joked about, or that the millions who laughed were bad people. Comedy has always ventured into the shadows, and there is real value in a show willing to look at things others turn away from. The question is not whether to go into the dark, but what you do there. Whether you go to illuminate or simply to wallow, whether the darkness is in service of some truth or merely presented for its own shock, made comfortable, made recurring, made into a friendly little bit you chuckle at without thinking. And on that question, in these recurring choices, the show too often chose the emptier path, the path of normalized cruelty presented as harmless fun, the predator as lovable eccentric, the horror as background gag. The show did, to be fair, evolve on some of this over its very long life. Certain characters and certain kinds of jokes softened or receded in later years, as the culture shifted and as the people making the show grew more aware of how some of this material landed. The most indefensible recurring bits became less central, less frequent, quietly retired or dialed back. But they existed for years, decades even, aired to enormous audiences, absorbed into the cultural bloodstream, and they cannot be unaired. They are part of the permanent record of the show, part of what it was, part of what it taught a generation of viewers to find funny, and that is a darkness that no later softening can fully undo. Let that heaviness move through you slowly and pass on out. the way clouds move across a night sky. There is one specific member of the cartoon family whose treatment gathers up everything we have been talking about into a single, sustained example, a character who was turned, deliberately and repeatedly, into a target, and whose story is maybe the clearest window of all into what this show became. Let me tell you about her next. The punching bag. There is one member of the cartoon family whose treatment gathers up nearly everything we have talked about into a single, sustained, decade-long example. She is the eldest child, a teenage girl, and over the course of the show she was transformed from an ordinary character into something that even the show's own official descriptions have acknowledged with startling bluntness. In the promotional summaries that describe the cast, she is not called the daughter, or the sister, or the teenager. She is described, plainly, as the family's preferred dumping ground. The show itself, in its own marketing, tells you what she is. She is the one they dump on. That is her role. And the story of how she came to occupy that role is one of the quietest and most sustained cruelties in the show's history. In the very earliest seasons, she was not a punching bag at all. She was simply the ordinary one, the unremarkable teenage girl in a family full of larger-than-life characters. Her father was a loud, dim-witted force of chaos. Her mother was the exhausted voice of reason. Her little brother was a socially clueless boy, and the baby was a bizarre, scheming presence, and the dog could talk. Against that backdrop, a normal, slightly awkward, unpopular teenage girl seemed dull by comparison, and that was the entire joke. She was the plain one in an extraordinary household, and the humor came gently from how out of place her ordinariness felt. The teasing she received in those early years was mild, the sort of thing that happens to a lot of teenagers, exaggerated a little for comedy but grounded in something real and recognizable. Her family did not hate her. They simply did not pay her as much attention as she wanted, which is a nearly universal experience for a certain kind of quiet young person in a loud family. But somewhere after the show's return from cancellation, the jokes about her began to change, and the change was significant. The teasing stopped being about her being boring or overlooked, and started being about her being ugly, unwanted, worthless. The other characters began to comment openly and cruelly on her appearance. They recoiled from her. They treated her presence as something to be endured or escaped. And this shift mattered enormously, because it moved the target from something she could theoretically change, like being more confident or more interesting, to something she could never change: her own face, her own body, her very existence. The joke stopped being "she is a bit dull" and became "she should not exist." And the show discovered that this crueler joke got a reaction, and having found that reaction, it went back to that well again and again and again, for years. By the middle stretch of the show's run, the mistreatment of this character had become one of the defining features of the entire series, a recurring engine of comedy that the whole family participated in. The father, who in the early years had merely been inattentive, became actively, gleefully cruel toward his own daughter. The mother, once the warm and reasonable heart of the household, grew cold toward her. The siblings joined in. The whole family, and beyond them the whole town, seemed to unite around a single shared understanding that this girl was a legitimate target, that mistreating her was normal, that her suffering was funny. It was not the occasional jab. It was constant, relentless, woven through episode after episode, and it escalated over time rather than easing. What makes this particularly dark, when you sit with it, is the message it quietly sends, whether the show intended to send it or not. Here is a teenage girl whose entire narrative function became absorbing abuse, and she is in many ways the most sympathetic and most human character in the whole show. Think about what she actually wants across all those episodes. She wants to be loved. She wants her parents to be proud of her. She wants friends who care about her. She wants to feel like she belongs somewhere. These are the most basic, universal human longings there are. The things nearly every person wants, and especially the things nearly every teenager aches for. And the show punished her relentlessly, precisely for wanting them. It took the most relatable character, the one whose desires were the most human, and it made her the designated victim, and it invited the audience to laugh at her suffering week after week. There is a pattern that runs through the show's treatment of this character that reveals something important about the show as a whole, and it is worth naming. Every so often, the show would seem to reach for something better. It would produce an episode in which the father realizes he has been too cruel, in which he and his daughter reconcile, in which there is a genuine emotional moment of understanding and apology and warmth. And in the moment, these episodes could be genuinely affecting, could suggest that the character might finally be allowed to grow, that things might actually change. But then the next episode would arrive, and everything would reset. The reconciliation would be forgotten. The father would be back to his cruelty, the family back to their contempt, the girl back at the bottom of the pile, as if the touching episode had never happened. The reset button, pressed over and over, meant that no growth was ever allowed to stick, that every step forward was erased by the following week, that the lesson learned in one episode meant nothing because it would be unlearned before the next. This refusal to let characters grow is, in a way, the structural heart of the whole problem. A show that hits the reset button every week is a show that has decided its characters can never really change, that the status quo must always be restored, that whatever happened this week must be undone before next week, so that the machine can keep running in its familiar groove. And when the status quo you keep restoring is one in which a teenage girl is abused by her whole family, then every reset is a small, renewed cruelty, a fresh insistence that this is how things are and how they will always be. The touching reconciliation episodes were not really acts of mercy. They were, in a sense, part of the cruelty, because they raised the possibility of change only to snatch it away, again and again, teaching the audience that the girl's suffering was permanent and load-bearing, that the family literally needed her to be the target in order to function. The cruelty reached beyond the screen too, in a way that is worth mentioning. The actress who voiced this character for the overwhelming majority of the show's run gave the girl her voice for decades. And the character's mistreatment became so iconic, so embedded in the culture, that the catchphrases and cruelties associated with her followed the actress into the real world. That is a strange and slightly haunting thing to consider, that the abuse heaped on a fictional girl could echo out of the screen and attach itself, in small ways, to the real woman who spoke for her, a reminder that even the cartoon cruelties do not stay perfectly sealed inside the cartoon. Now, to be fair, and once again the show demands a to be fair, the treatment did soften in the show's later years. As the culture shifted, and as the people making the show became more conscious of how this material landed, the relentless abuse of the character eased. She began to get episodes where she was competent, where she fought back, where she was allowed to be something other than a victim. The show demonstrated in these later, kinder episodes that it had always known how to write her well, that the talent to give her real depth and dignity had been there the whole time. And that, in its own way, is the final twist of the knife, because it means the years of cruelty were never necessary. The show could have written her with care from the beginning. It chose not to. It chose, for the better part of a decade, to make her a punching bag, because the punching was easier and got a reaction, and only much later did it decide she deserved better. So, her story becomes a kind of summary of everything darker about the show, compressed into a single character. The early warmth that faded, the discovery that cruelty got a reaction, the escalation of that cruelty over years, the refusal to let anything grow or change, the reset button erasing every good moment. The talent that was always there but so often set aside in favor of the easy, mean laugh. And underneath it all, the uncomfortable fact that a mass audience laughed along, that the abuse of this sympathetic, human, longing girl was rewarded with exactly the response that kept it going. If you want to understand what this show became in its long middle years, you could do worse than to simply watch what it did to her, patiently, cruelly, week after week, to the most relatable character it ever created. Let that settle and let it soften as it goes. We have nearly reached the end of our long walk through the shadows. There is one more region to pass through, the way the show's very humor curdled over time, from something sharp into something merely shocking, and then we will come, at last, back to where we started, to a young man and a plane he was 10 minutes too late to catch. The curdling, there is a difference between darkness that has a point and darkness that is merely dark, and one of the saddest truths about this show is how slowly and quietly it slid from the first kind to the second. In its early years, the show was genuinely, defensively edgy. It went to places other cartoons feared, made jokes about religion and race and death and every taboo it could find, but there was, underneath the shock, a mind at work. The jokes were dark, but they were also constructed, layered, set up, and paid off with real craft. You laughed because the writing was sharp and had caught you off guard, because underneath the offense there was intelligence. Over time, though, that intelligence thinned out, and the show came to rely more and more on shock for its own sake, on simply showing you something extreme and trusting that the extremity itself would substitute for a joke. That slow curdling, from clever darkness into empty shock, is worth understanding on its own, because it explains a great deal about why so many longtime fans quietly drifted away. Consider the way violence changed on the show. In the early seasons, the violence was cartoon violence, the ancient and harmless kind that every animated comedy has always used. A character would be flattened or bonked or sent flying, and in the next scene they would be perfectly fine, because everyone understood it was not real. It was the weightless slapstick of drawings, and nobody took it seriously or was meant to. But as the years passed, the violence on the show grew steadily more graphic, more realistic, more genuinely disturbing. The injuries stopped being silly and started being grotesque. The show began depicting harm in gory, anatomical detail, characters shown with exposed brains, with eyeballs hanging from their sockets, with wounds rendered not for slapstick but for a kind of shock horror effect, and all of it still framed as comedy, still scored and timed like a joke, the audience still invited to laugh. The gap between the harmless bonk of the early years and the anatomical gore of the later years is enormous, and it happened so gradually that many viewers did not notice until they went back and watched an old episode and felt, with a small jolt, how different the two things really were. The same curdling happened with the show's use of disgust. In the early seasons, a quick moment of grossness might appear as a small part of a larger, smarter joke, a single beat in a well-constructed sequence. In the later seasons, the grossness often became the entire joke. Whole scenes built around bodily functions or repulsive imagery with no punchline underneath, no setup, no payoff, nothing but the disgust itself, presented in the apparent belief that if the audience could be made uncomfortable enough, that discomfort would somehow convert into laughter. Sometimes it did. Often it simply made people want to look away. The show seemed to have confused two things that are not the same: being shocking and being funny, and the more it leaned on the first, the further it drifted from the second. There is a mathematical cruelty to shock as a comedic strategy, and it is worth naming because it explains the show's long decline better than almost anything else. Shock has a ceiling. The first time you see something extreme, it gets a reaction. The 10th time, you are numb to it. The 100th time, you are bored. A form of comedy built on shock can only survive by escalating, by going further and further, more graphic, more disturbing, more extreme, chasing a reaction that gets harder and harder to provoke as the audience grows more and more desensitized. Eventually, you run out of places to go. You have shown everything, shocked in every direction, and there is nothing left that can startle a crowd you have spent years numbing. Compare that to a comedy built on genuine wit, which has no ceiling at all, because there are infinite ways to be clever, endless fresh angles and surprises and constructions. A show built on cleverness can renew itself forever. A show built on shock is always racing toward an exhaustion it cannot avoid. And this show, over its long life, chose more and more to build on shock, and so it raced, inevitably, toward that exhaustion, escalating its violence and its grossness and its cruelty in search of a reaction from an audience it had itself made numb. Perhaps the strangest symptom of this whole decline was the way the show began to comment on its own decline, right there inside the episodes. As it aged, the show grew fond of breaking the fourth wall, of having its characters acknowledge that they were on a television show, speak directly to the audience, and, most tellingly, make jokes about the show's own declining quality. Characters would remark on how long the show had been on the air, on how it was not as good as it used to be, on the network, on the writers, on the very criticisms that fans and critics had been making for years. To some viewers, this self-awareness was charming, a sign that the show was in on the joke, that it knew exactly what it had become and could laugh at itself. But to others, and this reading grows more persuasive the more you think about it, the constant self-mockery made things worse rather than better. Because a show acknowledging that it has gotten worse is not the same as a show getting better. If anything, the endless winking admissions revealed that the people making the show knew precisely what was wrong with it, knew it had declined, knew it was leaning on shortcuts and shock, and chose to make jokes about that fact rather than actually fixing it. Self-awareness without change is just a more sophisticated form of giving up. The show could see its own curdling clearly enough to joke about it, and it kept curdling anyway. There is a deeper loss folded into all of this, and it is the loss of the thing that made the show worth loving in the first place. The early show, for all its edge, had a warmth underneath. The family, however dysfunctional, however chaotic, ultimately loved one another, and episodes often ended with some small note of genuine affection, a reconciliation, an apology, a quiet acknowledgement that, beneath all the madness, these were people who belonged together. That warmth was the ground the comedy stood on, the reason the jokes did not feel merely mean, the human heart that made you care what happened to these characters. And as the show curdled, as the shock crowded out the wit, and the cruelty crowded out the affection, that warmth drained away. The family stopped feeling like people who loved each other and started feeling like people who could barely tolerate one another, trading cruelties, indifferent to each other's suffering, held together by nothing warmer than the fact that they shared a house and a set of running gags. When the warmth left, the darkness stopped being the darkness of a loving family behaving badly and became the darkness of a group of strangers being cruel to each other for a laugh, and that is a much colder and emptier thing to watch. You can trace this curdling in the way the audience talked about the show over the years. In the early days, people watched an episode from beginning to end, and were invested in what happened, in the story, in the characters, in the small emotional stakes. In the later days, the conversation shifted. People spoke of watching in the hope that one of the random cutaways might be funny enough to justify sitting through the rest of individual moments rather than whole episodes, of a highlights reel rather than a show. The thing had transformed, in the eyes of many who had loved it, from a series you followed into a slot machine you fed, pulling the lever again and again in the hope that this time the reels might line up into something worth the wait. And a slot machine, however occasionally rewarding, is a lonely and mechanical kind of entertainment, a long way from the warm, sharp, surprising show that people had fallen for at the start. That is the curdling, the slow souring of a genuinely brilliant comedy into something that too often settled for being merely shocking, that traded its wit for volume and its warmth for cruelty and its craft for the easy jolt. It did not happen all at once, and it was never total, and there were always bright exceptions, episodes and moments that recalled the old brilliance and proved the talent had never entirely left. But the overall drift was unmistakable, a long slide from clever darkness into empty shock, from a show that made you laugh because it was smarter than you expected, into a show that too often made you wince because it was louder and more extreme than you wanted. And the show, in its endless, self-aware winking, seemed to know it, and kept sliding anyway, because the machine had to keep running, and shock was cheap, and the audience, numbed and habitual, kept watching. Let all of that grow quiet now. We have walked a long way together through these shadows, and we are almost home. There is just one last thing to say, and to say it we have to go all the way back to the beginning, back to a hotel room in Boston and a young man with a splitting headache who had no idea that the worst morning of a nation's history was about to become the luckiest morning of his life. What the darkness adds up to. We have gathered a great many dark truths now, and before we come to rest, it is worth pausing to see what they add up to when you lay them side by side in the quiet. Because taken one at a time, each of these stories is just an incident, a controversy, a bad episode, a lawsuit, a ban. But taken together, they form a shape, and the shape tells you something about the show, and maybe about all of us who watched it, that no single story could tell on its own. The first thing you notice, when you lay them all out, is how often the darkness was not an accident but a choice. This matters, because it would be easy and comforting to imagine that the show simply drifted into these places, that the cruelty and the shock and the mockery were unfortunate side effects of a comedy machine running on autopilot. But that is not what the record shows. The banned abortion episode was buried by a deliberate financial calculation, stated out loud. The mockery of a dead woman was defended, not regretted, with a complaint about double standards. The transgender jokes continued after a public promise to do better, which means someone kept choosing to write them. The punching bag treatment of a teenage girl was sustained for years and could have stopped at any time, because the later softening proved the writers always knew how to do better. Again and again, the show reached a fork, a moment where it could have chosen the kinder or the smarter or the braver path. And again, when the cruel or the shocking or the profitable path was easier, it took that one instead. The darkness was not weather that happened to the show. It was a series of decisions the show made. The second thing you notice is how consistently money sat underneath the choices. Not always, not in every case, but as a steady undercurrent running beneath the whole long story. The show came back from the dead because it was profitable. It buried its bravest episode to protect its advertisers. It fed on controversy because controversy was attention, and attention was revenue. It kept going, decade after decade, past its own creators' stated creative peak, because it had become a cheap and reliable engine of money that no one could justify switching off. When you follow the darkness back to its root, you find, more often than not, a ledger. The show's willingness to go anywhere and offend anyone had exactly one consistent limit, and that limit was not taste or decency or conscience. It was whatever the sponsors would not tolerate. Cross the line into cruelty, and the machine shrugged and cashed the checks. Cross the line into something that might spook the advertisers, and suddenly the fearless show discovered it had limits after all. The third thing you notice, and this is the most uncomfortable one, is that the show did not create its darkness alone. It had a partner in every dark choice, and that partner was the audience. The predatory neighbor kept coming back because he got laughs. The shock kept escalating because the shock worked. The punching bag kept getting punched because the punching drew a reaction. Comedy is a transaction, and every one of these dark bits survived only because, on the other side of the screen, millions of people gave the show exactly the response that keeps a joke alive. The show held up a mirror, and a great many of us looked into it and laughed, and in laughing, we voted to keep the darkness coming. It is far more comfortable to blame the writers, the network, the creator, and there is real blame there to go around. But the honest accounting has to include the crowd, the enormous global crowd that rewarded the cruelty and the shock with its attention and its laughter, and that is a harder thing to sit with, because that crowd includes, at one time or another, most of us. And yet, the fourth thing you notice, the thing that keeps the whole picture from collapsing into pure condemnation, is that the darkness was never the whole story. Woven all through it were flashes of something better, and those flashes were real. The show cast a woman with Down syndrome to voice a character with Down syndrome and gave her the role of her career and a platform to speak with more clarity than anyone else in the controversy she landed in. The banned abortion episode, whatever you think of the subject, was a genuinely brave and thoughtful piece of writing, braver than most of what aired around it. The transgender character, for all the cruelty aimed at her, was born partly from a writer processing his own real family, his own real parent. Even the punching bag girl was, in the end, allowed to grow, allowed dignity in the show's later and kinder years. The talent was always there. The capacity for care was always there. That is precisely what makes the darkness sting rather than simply disgust, because it was never the product of people who did not know better. It was the product of people who often knew better and chose the darker path anyway, and who, every so often, chose the better one and reminded you of everything the show could have been if it had chosen that path more often. The fifth thing you notice, when you lay it all out, is how far the show fell, and how that fall gives the whole story its shape of tragedy rather than mere failure. Because this was not a show that was always mediocre and stayed mediocre, it reached genuine heights. In 2009, it achieved something almost no animated show in the history of television had ever managed. It was nominated for one of the industry's highest honors, the award for the best comedy series on television, competing not against other cartoons but against the finest live-action comedies of its era. To grasp how rare that was, you have to know that the last time an animated series had earned that particular recognition was back in 1961, nearly half a century earlier, for a show about a modern Stone Age family. Not even the most acclaimed and celebrated animated comedy of the modern age, the long-running yellow-skinned juggernaut, had ever managed that specific nomination. This show did. For a moment, it stood at the very summit of what animated comedy could be, taken seriously as a creative force, honored alongside the best that television had to offer. Now set that summit beside where the show ended up, and feel the distance between the two. From a historic nomination for the best comedy on television, to a slow exile onto a quiet weeknight, watched by a fraction of its former audience, kept alive not for its brilliance but for its usefulness as a cheap and reliable brand. That is the arc, and it is the arc of a fall, not a flatline. A show that had never been good could not have fallen, because there was no height to fall from. This show climbed to the peak of its form, earned the recognition of an entire industry, proved beyond argument that it could be genuinely great, and then, over the long years that followed, it slid down and down and down into shock and cruelty and self-aware winking and the endless mechanical churn of a machine that had outlived its own inspiration. The tragedy is not that it was bad. The tragedy is that it was, for a while, so good, and that we got to watch, in slow motion, across 2 decades, what happens when something that good is left to run on profit alone. So, what does the darkness add up to? It adds up to a portrait of something very human, scaled up to the size of a global phenomenon, a creative work that began with passion and vision and a young man's fierce desire to bring something to life. A work that succeeded beyond anyone's wildest hopes, and in succeeding, became valuable, and in becoming valuable, became a machine, and in becoming a machine, slowly let the passion cool into profit, and the wit curdle into shock, and the warmth drain into cruelty, all while a numbed and habitual audience kept watching, and kept laughing, and kept feeding the thing that fed on them. It is a story about how the things we make can outlive the reasons we made them, how a work of art can become a product, how a mirror can teach the people looking into it to laugh at things they should have flinched from. And it is a story, too, about how even in the middle of all that, sparks of the original brilliance and the original heart kept surfacing, refusing to be entirely extinguished, reminders of what the whole thing had been at the start and might have stayed. That is the shape the darkness makes when you lay it all out in the quiet. Not a simple story of a bad show doing bad things, but something sadder and more complicated and more true. A story about creation and profit and cruelty and the strange complicity of everyone who watched, including, if we are honest, ourselves. And at the very center of it, holding the whole improbable thing together, is a single small fact that we have circled back to more than once. A fact so unlikely that if you wrote it into a story, no one would believe it. Let me take you back to it one last time, and let it be the thing you carry with you as you finally drift off. The man who missed the plane. Come back with me one last time to the very beginning. Not the beginning of the show, but the beginning of everything. The morning that made the show possible, the morning that made all of these dark truths possible, the morning that had to happen exactly as it did, or none of the rest of it would exist at all. It is early autumn, 2001. It is a Tuesday. In a hotel room in Boston, a young man is waking up badly. His head is pounding. He stayed out too late the night before, drank more than he should have, and now he is paying for it in the oldest and most ordinary way, with a hangover that makes the morning feel like wading through wet sand. He has a flight to catch, a plane to take him home across the country, and he is running late, partly because of the way he feels and partly because someone wrote down the wrong time. He gathers himself, gets to the airport, hurries to the gate, and finds that he is too late. The doors have closed. The plane has already pulled back. He has missed it by about 10 minutes. If you had been standing beside him in that moment, you would have seen nothing remarkable at all. Just a tired young man, mildly annoyed, rubbing his temples, resigned to rebooking and waiting. Missing a flight is one of the most forgettable frustrations in the world. It happens to everyone. It carries no weight, no meaning, no sense of anything larger. He rebooks. He wanders into the lounge. He finds a quiet corner and, because he still feels terrible, he closes his eyes and sleeps. And while he sleeps, the world ends and begins again. The plane he missed by 10 minutes is hijacked in the sky above Massachusetts and flown into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. It is the first plane. It is the beginning of the deadliest terrorist attack in the history of his country. Everyone aboard dies. And the young man sleeps through the first 45 minutes of it, unaware, until he wakes to a room full of commotion and slowly, in pieces, understands that he was supposed to be on that plane, that he should be dead, that a hangover and a mistaken departure time are the only reasons he is still breathing. Somewhere, people who knew his travel plans are already grieving him, believing him gone, and it will be 20 minutes more before the truth catches up and turns their grief back into relief. Sit with the sheer improbability of it. Everything you have heard tonight, every dark truth, every controversy, every banned episode, every furious family, every lawsuit, every prediction, every cruelty, the entire vast empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, all of it, every last piece, hangs on that one morning. Pull that thread, and it all unravels. If he had not gone out drinking, if his travel agent had written down the right time, if he had been 10 minutes faster to the gate, there is no talking dog, no yellow shirt, no cutaway gags, no banned abortion episode, no mocked dead woman, no manatees, no 30-year empire. There is only a name, read aloud at memorials, one more person lost on that terrible morning, and a cartoon pilot that would have died in a vault, unaired and unfinished, its creator gone before he could fight for it. The whole enormous machine, the whole tangled web of light and darkness we have spent this time exploring, exists because a young man had a headache and was 10 minutes late. There is a strange and quiet lesson buried in that, and it is a fitting one to fall asleep on. We tell ourselves that big things have big causes, that empires and phenomena and cultural forces arise from grand designs and powerful intentions. But so often the truth is smaller and stranger than that. So often the enormous thing turns out to rest on some tiny, accidental hinge, a missed flight, a wrong time, a lucky hangover, a coincidence so slight that no one noticed it as it happened. The man himself understood this better than anyone. He refused, ever after, to treat his survival as destiny, as proof that he was chosen for something. He insisted that it was chance, pure chance, that all of us have 100 close calls a year we never even notice, that a day earlier he might have stepped off a curb 5 minutes too soon and been struck by a car and never known how close he came. He would not make his survival into a prophecy. He knew it was luck, and he lived, by his own account, more or less the same afterward as before. And maybe that refusal is the final dark truth, the one that ties all the others together. Because if the whole empire rests on nothing more than luck, then there is no deeper meaning to any of it, no grand justification, no cosmic reason the show had to exist and had to do the things it did. It simply happened, the way things happen, because a man missed a plane and lived, and built a thing, and that thing succeeded, and in succeeding became a machine, and the machine did what machines do, running on, generating money and controversy and cruelty and occasional brilliance, long after anyone remembered why. There is no destiny in it. There is only a chain of ordinary human choices and ordinary human accidents, stretching back to a hungover morning that could so easily have gone the other way. It is a haunting thing to consider, lying here in the dark, that so much can hinge on so little. That the difference between a name on a memorial and an empire worth a fortune can be 10 minutes. That all the laughter and all the outrage and all the darkness and all the light of an entire cultural phenomenon can trace back to a young man's decision on one particular night to have a few more drinks than he should have. The world is stranger and more fragile and more accidental than we usually let ourselves believe. And the story of this show, underneath all its shadows, is really a story about that fragility, about how thin the thread is that any of us hang by, about how the smallest turns of chance ripple outward into things no one could ever have predicted. He is still here, that man who missed the plane. He built his empire and expanded it and grew rich and busy and calm, and somewhere along the way, the fire that made him fight for his fragile little show cooled into the steady management of a valuable and immortal thing that runs mostly on its own. And the show goes on, renewed for years into the future, watched by millions in the background of their lives, still wearing its familiar face, still speaking in its familiar voices, carrying all its dark truths quietly inside it. A monument, in the end, to a hangover and a missed flight, and the strange, accidental, unearned gift of one more ordinary morning. That is where our long walk ends, back at the beginning, at the smallest possible hinge holding up the largest possible weight. Let it settle over you gently now, this sense of how much can turn on how little, and let your breathing slow, and let the day finally release you. Thank you for staying with me through all of this, through every shadow and every strange true story. If these long, quiet journeys through the dark corners of the things we thought we knew are the kind of thing that helps you drift off, then do me one small kindness before you go. Leave a like so that more people looking for a calm place to rest their minds can find their way here. And subscribe, so the next time you need somewhere quiet to fall asleep, another one of these will be waiting for you. Rest well now. Let your eyes stay closed. And I will see you in the quiet next time with another story told softly in the dark.